We're ready, Ms. Stallnut.
Let's see.
Take his gavel.
All right, well, good evening. Welcome, everyone, to the June 2017 Arlington County Planning Commission public hearings. We have 3 items on our agenda for this evening. It is our intent, my intent as the chair, that we would get through all 3 of these items plus our organizational business tonight. However, if it looks like we're going to be running past 11 p.m., that is our cutoff, then it is possible that we may carry over the 3rd item on our agenda, which would be the Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan, that we would carry that over until Wednesday evening. So we're going to do our best to move expeditiously but thoroughly through all of our agenda and hopefully get through all of these items this evening. If anyone that is here to speak for an item, please make sure that you have your speaker slips turned in to our clerk over here to my right before that item is called. I would like to remind everyone that we are being broadcast and recorded, both video and audio. So accordingly, all speakers must use a microphone. And now is also a great time to silence all of your personal electronics, and also please keep them away from any of the microphones because they can cause interference. So thank you. And with that, Madam Clerk, would you please call the first item?
Our first item is the Williamsburg Neighborhood Conservation Plan updates. We have Katie Brown Henry and Tim McIntosh, planning staff, to discuss this item this evening.
Good evening. I've had the pleasure of working with the Williamsburg Civic Association for the last couple of years in updating their neighborhood conservation plan, first done in 2000. They've completed all the necessary steps to get to this point, including conducting a survey, writing the plan document, and presenting it to the Civic Association and getting full support for it, and also presenting it in CAC, which they did last month. Jonathan Levine, who is the Neighborhood Conservation Advisory Committee representative for the Williamsburg Civic Association, will give you a brief presentation on their planning process.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Levine. I'm the NC rep for the Williamsburg Civic Association. And I know you've got a lot to go over tonight, so I will try to be efficient with my time. So, the Williamsburg Civic Association, we're very proud of being here tonight. We're proud of what we've accomplished. This has been more than a 2-year process for us in putting this plan together, and we are very proud of it. Our original plan was adopted in 2000, so it's been a long time coming to revising our plan. We sent our surveys out back in 2015, and we spent months just drafting that survey, and we were happy with the responses that we got back. It was about 18% response rate that we got back, which for an NC plan is actually pretty good. We've got 1,100 households in the NC, so we were happy with our response rate. We sent it out, we did a Survey Monkey, and we hand-delivered physical copies to all the households. We spent a long time gathering the data, collecting the data, and trying to collate the data. And we spent a lot of time we did a lot of open-ended questions in our survey, and the reason why we did that was because we really wanted to hear what people had to say, and that took a lot of extra time in trying to encapsulate that. But we were glad that we went that route. It was extra work, but I think it was worth it. You have the timeline in front of you. The initial presentation of the draft was this past December, and we had some comment period back and forth with the residents, and we were able to unanimously approve our plan in February. We submitted it to the staff shortly thereafter, and then this last month in May, we were able to present it to the whole NCAC, and we received its recommendation for approval. So now we're here before you. So a little bit about the Williamsburg Civic Association. For those of you who don't know, We are sort of in the upper northwest part of the county where Falls Church and McLean and Arlington all come together. We are bordered by Trinidad Street, North 35th and 26th Street, and part of Sycamore Street. Our defining feature would be the Williamsburg Circle and Minor Hill, which goes up onto Powhatan. So I don't know if any of you have been up there, but if it's either the second or the highest point in Arlington County. It is a very nice spot. There's also a water reservoir there. Williamsburg has a very rich history dating back to Native American times when it used to be a trading route. Little Falls and Williamsburg were trading routes. That changed when Europeans came over, and the road became, I guess, a road to move tobacco on. The Minor Hill, which is the defining feature, was owned by the Minor family, the George Minor family, and they played a prominent role, lasting role, in the Williamsburg neighborhood, and that's why Minor Hill is called what it is. Right below Minor Hill, there's another little park called Sharp Park, and then we have our Williamsburg Circle, which is sort of the center of our community. Years ago, it said that Teddy Roosevelt used to come up and spend time up there. Whether that's true or not, I couldn't tell you. The other thing that we're proud of is that Northwest Boundary Stone number 1 is in our Civic Association, one of the original DC boundary stones, but it's in somebody's backyard, so you can't actually go look at it, but it's kind of cool. Anyways, as far as demographics, the Civic Association has grown slightly in the last 20 years, from 1990 to 2010 in the census, and anecdotally, I would say it's continued to grow. We have reported as 85% white, 4.5% Asian, 1.7% is black, 4.8% as Hispanic or Latino. We are, as compared to the county as a whole, we tend to be more white, and then we also tend to be an older community than the county, relative to the county as a whole. More than 27% reported as 55 and older, compared to 18.7% for Arlington as a whole. In addition, far fewer of the Civic Association residents are within the young adult range of 25 to 34, compared with Arlington as a whole. As far as institutions go, we don't have that many. We are mainly single-family homes, but we do have some recreation, as I mentioned, Minor Hill and Sharp Park. Education-wise, the only school that's actually in our Civic Association is Nottingham Elementary School, but we do feed into Williamsburg Middle School, Bishop O'Connell, and Discovery Elementary School. Religious, we have Little Falls Presbyterian Church, and we have no government facilities. For our neighborhood goals and recommendations, it can really be boiled down to a certain few things. The residents of Williamsburg are very happy with how things are, and generally would like things to, I would say, stay the same, but recognizing that time is moving on, things are developing, and we have to be consistent with the needs of the residents. Generally, high opinions of county services, no real complaints. Infrastructure, again, really no issues. Yes, we have some cracked sidewalks. Yes, we have some power lines that could be maintained a little better, but these were not major issues for people. Schools, very high level of satisfaction with the public schools. An issue with, I would say, quality of life issues with Bishop O'Connell, not related to, not different than any other neighborhood that would have with a high school environment. So really very high marks. For land use and zoning, again, Williamsburg is primarily single-family homes, And like a lot of the neighborhoods, you have a lot of development going on. We're a very attractive community, and you have the push and pull between residents who live in sort of the original, smaller brick houses and the new development that's coming in, that are houses that people want and that are being built, and just the general push and pull between the needs and wants of new people coming in or current residents who want a larger home, and some of the other goals of maintaining the tree canopy, green space, and sort of a harmony of aesthetics. But again, for the most part, very, very high marks. For our parks, we only have a couple of parks. We have Minor Hill, we have Sharp Park. We don't have any other real green space to call our own. But we would like some improvements done with the two parks that we have. Minor Hill is tricky because of the water storage tanks that are there. We have a park, but we're sort of discouraged from using it because we don't want to attract a lot of people where the water storage tanks are. But that doesn't mean that it can't be beautified. I don't know if you've ever been there. Years ago, there used to be tennis courts. Those are gone, and it's kind of ratty looking. There's some sparse trees. It's just not a real inviting place, but it is something that we would like to take care of. And it goes down a hill to Sharp Park, which also has a potential of being very beautiful, but it's kind of overgrown. There's a lot of invasives, and it's right next to the Williamsburg Circle, and which is a high traffic area, and it's just not very easy to get to and from the park. So, we would really like to take care of that and make it a more inviting place. One of the things that we've discussed is the possibility of maybe getting a bike share there, water fountain, some kind of ornamental fencing, benches. Our commercial establishments, again, get very high marks. We tend to have the things that we need in our two little strip malls that are right across the circle from each other. We've got a bank, we've got a dry cleaner, we've got frozen yogurt, we've got convenience stores. Really, there wasn't anything that needs to be changed. There is desire for maybe a coffee shop or a bakery, but the issues there was discussing with the landlords what the neighbors or what the residents' interests are, and maybe they can possibly attract somebody that's more in line. In the NC plan that we actually submitted, there's a picture of an electronic, like a water vaping store that was sort of, it was a little, it was a minor controversy when it came in, but it only lasted 6 months. But it was sort of the kind of thing that we wish that we could have maybe talked to the landlord more about, who could they draw in. Anyways, urban forestry. The decline in the tree canopy is a major concern, and that was something that came up in the survey results that people are very interested in. Since we have such a lack of green space in the Civic Association, between the development and Dutch elm disease and other environmental aspects affecting the trees, doing things to protect the tree canopy was very high on the list. And then for the neighborhood goals, lastly, for aging in place, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are an older community, and we are very interested in allowing the older residents to stay and to age in place. Arlington Neighborhood Villages is a topic that's very interesting to our residents. It's something we'd like to learn more of and hopefully bring some of that. Also, walkability, working with the county on improving compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act and things of that nature. Katie, if you could go to the major concerns. Yeah, okay. So tried to boil the major concerns down to three issues. Traffic and pedestrian safety would be the number one issue that came up in our survey results. And it's not surprising. We had a tragedy a few years ago with a mother of young children who was killed outside of Nottingham Elementary School, and it affected a lot of people, and it really raised the issue of traffic and pedestrian safety to the forefront, and it's something that we would like more done. As I mentioned, loss of green space and trees, and overdevelopment generally was an issue in the survey. Construction of large home on small lots and loss of architectural harmony. As far as the recommendations, wrong way.
No recommendations.
None. That's why I said we wouldn't be here long. So one thing that we did with our recommendations was recommendations not just to the county board and to the staff, the things that we want the county board and staff to do, but also things that the Civic Association, what can we do as well? And because it was important that this document, look inward as well. And so in going through the recommendations, I'll highlight both, but I want to highlight a lot of where we're saying, things that we need to do as a community. Starting out for the land use and housing, we did discuss modifying the zoning ordinance to require developers to consult with civic associations of by right construction, including issues such as maintenance of mature trees on site and other impacts of construction, and initiate new procedures for notifying adjacent neighbors of by right development. But this is all to be done in recognizing the need of consumers and the need of residents who want to have larger homes. There's no objection to that, but we would like to have a balance struck, as were the results of the survey. Re-examining the county subdivision ordinance on access requirements for pipe stem and infill development and a minimum street coverage to ensure property values of nearby homes are not adversely affected. Re-examine the county's zoning ordinance for residential zones in terms of lot coverage for buildings, including decks and detached structures, balancing the goal of preserving open spaces with the need to create housing responsive to consumer needs and compatible with the high land values in this part of North Arlington, and improve the procedures for notifying the civic associations and community residents about variance applications. For infrastructure, we'd like the civic association needs to follow up with the county more to ensure timely inspection and repair, because we're the ones who are going to see if there's a problem with the infrastructure, and we need to do our part in notifying the county. And we'd like to be able to provide specific guidance to our residents about how they can report. We would like the county to meet and work closely with utility and communication companies to design guidelines to prevent sort of the chronic issues that come up. You get a lot of finger pointing and a lot of, well, that's not my line, that's not my pole, and just some way to coordinate that better. And we would like the county to devote more resources to the maintenance of county-owned street trees in the medians or along sidewalks. Again, the tree canopy was very important to us. Recommendations for our schools. Traffic and pedestrian safety was the big one at Nottingham. Even though Tuckahoe Elementary School is not in our civic association, it is right on the border, and our residents use it, and there's a lot of spillover in terms of the use. And just to coordinate with all the stakeholders, the Civic Association, East Falls Church Civic Association, to meet about the recreational use of Tuckahoe Park. For the Williamsburg Middle School, again, not in our Civic Association, but because we feed into it, we got a lot of feedback regarding having better landscaping, and I think that really has to do with all the trailers that are there, and continuing working with the Williamsburg Lights Group. As I mentioned earlier, one issue did come up with Bishop O'Connell, and there's an ad hoc group that's working on what we call quality of life issues associated with the school. And to continue the work of the ad hoc group and to continue to work with Bishop O'Connell, we are neighbors and we want to work together and be good neighbors to each other.
Is this, how many more slides do you have?
Almost done.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. For traffic and pedestrian safety, I think these are fairly common ones that we're asking for. Near schools, 15 miles per hour, change stop sign criteria, better signage and raised crosswalks. Install signage, lower speed limits generally, and one of our most important projects, which hopefully we'll have some good news coming on soon, is to complete the Sycamore Street project, which is reducing the Sycamore Street from 2 lanes each way to 1 lane each way with a median. And then, well, I already discussed earlier about what we'd like to do with the parks and the commercial establishments. For the park side, what I didn't, the Williamsburg Circle, it's not technically a park, but there are things that I think that we can do there. There is mention about the Birch Payne Cemetery, which is a family-owned cemetery, and this is something that's part of our hopes and dreams, that maybe one day we could do something with beautification of it, but we realize that it's not on anybody's agenda right now. This is just something that maybe down the road, and we wanted to have it in the NC plan in the event that, who knows, 10 years from now, there is an opportunity to do something, and we wanted the neighborhood's desires to be known on that. And I think I've mentioned everything on aging in place, and I can skip the rest, I believe. If you have any questions, I'm free to answer them.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Brown-Henry, did you have a staff presentation? No. Okay. Are there any public speakers?
One.
We have one public speaker. Thank you. If you don't mind sticking around, we may have some questions for you. Thank you for the presentation. Very thorough job, both in the NC plan and in the presentation. Mr. Jerez.
Good evening. As it relates to Arlington County, new urbanism, or smart growth, as it's also known, can be defined as packing as many people, vehicles, events, and activities into as small an area as possible, with essential infrastructure a secondary priority or consideration. Williamsburg is another neighborhood on Arlington's border. Williamsburg was planned to be a suburban neighborhood of single-family homes with streets, sidewalks, schools, wastewater, and storm water infrastructure designed for low-density neighborhoods of single-family homes. Like 4 Mile Run Valley, Arlington, Claremont, Glen Carlin, Carlin Springs, Roslyn, Arlington Ridge, and several other neighborhoods, border neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods were not designed to be repurposed to be satellite public infrastructure for urbanized residential neighborhoods. And residential neighborhoods designed in the future for smart growth redevelopment. Regarding housing, little or no affordable housing is being constructed for persons under 40% of area median income, or about $45,000 a year, through AHIF. My neighbors in Fairlington are concerned that townhouses in my neighborhood will be repurposed with affordable, although illegal, basement apartments. Other neighborhoods of single-family homes are concerned that homes will be repurposed into 2 to 4 unit apartment buildings, McMansions, for example, which would greatly benefit residential renovation developers. Mr. Gutschall, do we know any of those? To the detriment of our neighborhood's quality of life. Regarding parks, recreation, and open space, you should be aware that the City of Alexandria has been ordered to spend hundreds of millions to upgrade its wastewater treatment. Fairfax County residents recently voted to oppose implementation of a meals tax. So it's unlikely that either jurisdiction will be spending any money anytime soon for additional parks, recreation, sports, open space infrastructure. Meanwhile, it's apparent that Arlington is overbuilding sports, recreation, and community infrastructure for residents of several adjacent areas. Time to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other commissions represented this evening? I don't believe there ought to be, and Transportation Commission did not hear this, of course. All right, so this matter is now with the Planning Commission, and I think we can just go ahead and open it up for any questions that anyone has, if to the extent that we can move through sort of in an orderly fashion from top to bottom, and I think the matrix that staff provided with the layout of the staff responses to the specific recommendations, I personally found that to be fairly useful kind of summary of what's in here. But really, whatever questions anyone has, I'm happy to recognize. Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Commissioner Gutschall. I have first point to staff and then a question to follow up. I note throughout the plan, North Arlington continues to be capitalized and then non-capitalized, so it moves from a proper place to a direction. And since we all pay our taxes to Arlington, it always draws my attention when I see that. Your comment doesn't address, I believe, the balancing the goal of preserving open space with the need to create housing responsive to consumer needs and compatible with high land values in this part of North Arlington. I'm trying to understand exactly how lot coverage and what staff thought about with regard to this question.
Commissioner Hughes, could you
tell us
pinpoint where you're reading from or what specifically?
Which comment that was, please?
Certainly. In staff report, it's on page 1 as the numbering, on page 23 of the Neighborhood Conservation Plan. It's also referenced on page 13 of their plan.
And what was your question, please?
What thoughts? Staff's response was, county studied lot coverage several years ago. Any additional reexamination of lot coverage is not part of the zoning ordinance amendments work plan. It does nothing to respectfully address whether the high land values in this part of North Arlington has something to do with lot coverage.
Okay. So as NC staff, we don't have any comment on that. We'll have to certainly get back to you with staff that could provide us more clarity with that, when that would be our planning section. So we'll have to follow up with you on that.
It's just a thought to take forward when you go to the board.
But were these recommendations routed through planning as part of this process?
They were. And so each department that has a question that relates to them has to provide us a response. They're not required to, but they usually respond to most of the recommendations. So it goes throughout the county, and those staff that are experts in that area will provide us responses.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Siegel.
I think, are we still on lot coverage? I wanted to talk about open space, but public open space, not open space through setbacks and
Go ahead.
go to the parks. Before that, I would just say maybe it would be useful for Williamsburg to take a look at what the work was that was done on lot coverage several years ago. Is there a way that you could provide them with a summary? I see that Ms. Albert is in the back of the room. I'm sure she could, or someone from staff could provide them. So it might be useful if you were to just look at what the work that was done several years ago, and to see if incrementally you might want to suggest another revision. I'm sure that would take a while, but it is responsive. I think this is kind of more responsive to what you were looking for, some substance on the issue. So that was my follow-up there. So I'll jump to parks. And here I just want to say thank you for a very orderly presentation of issues. Part of the county I'm all the way in the south. Part of the county I don't know as well as my own neighborhood, and it really is very useful to get that sort of detailed information about the mood and issues for another neighborhood. So I really do appreciate that and compliment you on all the work, because I know there's an awful lot of work that goes into this. And I guess my suggestion may invite you to do more work, but it's probably be worthwhile. And I wanted to suggest that in terms of the two parks, as you know, we're redoing the public spaces master plan. There will be a chance for the public to weigh in on the draft that we're now looking at, the working group is looking at, in, I believe, July. There'll be a number of opportunities, and I strongly suggest that you look at the draft. It's extremely well written. It's very well researched. I will just tell you we're struggling now with how to place value on open space that is not programmed, what people sometimes in a shortcut way refer to as active use. And it seems to me these two parks that you talk about are good cases in point for how would you upgrade through a maintenance program that does not necessarily put more stuff on the park, but makes it more inviting for people to sit, read, talk, walk, and kind of gather and meet each other. So that's one suggestion. The other is there are programs that work through sort of county neighborhood efforts, joint efforts on invasive plants. Are you familiar with those? Sarah Archer is the person, she's the point person. I'm aware of Haley Park in my neighborhood. Every month, they will go in, citizens will go in and pull out, take ivy off trees and do things like that. That's another way. It's really hard for Parks Department to take care of all of the open space. Arlington does have a lot of open space, actually, and you'll see that reflected in POPs. So there's some citizen participation that's required. And there are free trees available under the Chesapeake Bay program. And there are lots of trees now, I'm told, that could be planted. And the one final thing I'd like to suggest is something that I've been thinking about through my work on the POPs, and that is the kind of maintenance that is provided through DPR. Often, I think what is favored is big installations, big infrastructure, rather than that sort of day-to-day gardening, tree watering and things like that that's needed. And there would be a chance to weigh in on that as we're looking at the CIP, which will, the two-year process that we do that starts up, I think, sometime this summer. Lots of work ahead.
Commissioner Guerin.
As a follow-up to Commissioner Siegel's thoughtful comments about the park process, I wanted to let you know that I've already brought to the attention of Jim Feaster, who represents NC on the POPs planning process, your new plan and the references to the parks in it, so that he should be in contact with you too. I have some questions about the safety issues with transportation.
Let's see if there's any follow-up first on the parks. Sure, Commissioner Lantelmi.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. A lot of the points you raised, I was thinking about too, so I don't have to get into all of that sort of thing. I think that your ideas for the parks are very good. I was wondering whether, talking to staff, did these answers actually come from Parks and Recreation? Because it seemed like it was almost that they sort of just, we don't have any plans for it, talk to Urban Forester. It was very conclusory without any real answer to the various things that you were recommending. Did it go through Parks and Rec?
Correct, it did. And so they provided the response that you see there. And what we like to think with these recommendations too is that they are part of an ongoing dialogue that will take place for a while between the county and the neighborhood. And I just want to address the POPs study. We're planning, hopefully, maybe in July, to have someone come and do a presentation to the NCAC so that they have an opportunity to see the plan. But yes, Parks and Recreation did take a look at the comments.
Okay, because all the more reason for what Commissioner Siegel said, really have to look at those ongoing plans, start getting your words in there, start attending, because if you want anything to happen to those parks, you got to get into the process. Because I agree, those parks look like they can use a little more loving. They are an amenity that, it's a chicken egg thing. Right now you're saying not a lot of people use it, but I can see why they wouldn't, because it's sort of a mess. If it looked better, if you had started getting volunteers going for it, that could show commitment, and maybe that could go up higher on the priorities. So, that's it for parks. One thing, again, I think I concur with the rest of my fellow commissioners. You did a great job on this. I learned a lot about Williamsburg that I didn't know before, which is, really good. I'm stunned that 20% of your houses have been torn down and rebuilt in the past, 10, 15 years? That is a real eye-opening number. That neighborhood is changing very, very rapidly. I just noted that I found it was astonishing. But again, thank you for the work.
All right, Commissioner Schroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McIntosh or Ms. Brown-Henry, I have a question about the solar array suggested in Minor Park. So I'm in this table of page 5. It's number 16. Staff response to the suggestion of a solar array there is that the Dominion looked at it and then decided not to do it. I'm wondering, though, if it's a county-funded project, to support a county need, if it could be funded through NC. If it's a solar array with battery storage, if it's not going back to the grid, it would also serve, as is noted later in the report, there's a shade need there. It's a hot park, and solar could, if it's a ground mount, could offer some shade there as well. I'm wondering if you've looked at that option, and if you could respond to the kind of feasibility of that option.
Sure. It's not an option we have looked at in the past, and I think it's something that we should look into. All of the projects that we choose, that neighborhoods choose to do, that are park projects, have to be approved and reviewed by the Parks Department. So it's something we'd have to have a discussion with them about. But it would be something new for us, and I think worth looking into. I can't say for sure whether or not we could do it through NC. We'd have to take a look what our bond stipulations are in terms of what we can fund, but it's absolutely something we'd look into.
I would encourage you, Mr. McIntosh, to look into that with the Parks Department. You have nearby load need with the service commercial that's there. The park wouldn't serve that, but if you did have the battery storage, you could get around the kind of Dominion stuff because you're really not putting it back to the grid. It would be a costly project, and I don't know if it's necessarily appropriate for NC given what other burdens are there, but I think it might be something to kind of collaborate on, or maybe more holistically. I do commend the Civic Association for raising that. That is an interesting thing to do, and I also want to join other fellow commissioners in thanking the neighborhood for their work, and Ms. Brown-Henry, you always do a fantastic job. It's great to see you again, and you too, Mr. McIntosh.
Actually, I'd like to piggyback on that comment real quick and ask staff, what is the relationship between this process, where you have a neighborhood that is clearly, I think, very thoughtful and thought through a lot of issues, and this is, in my time on the commission here, I think each NC plan that comes forward is perhaps a little better than the one before it, and this really exemplifies that. This is really, I think, taking it up a notch and at a much higher level, much, a greater. We've gone way beyond in this plan, talking about curbs and gutters and sidewalks and street trees and things of that nature. And so there's a lot of interesting thought, and that question right there, both about the parks, what could we do with the parks, the idea of solar, some really creative thinking. So what role in this process is staff? Do you feel that staff is equipping the neighborhood with the right information that they can go forward and pursue these things and are empowered to pursue these ideas through the various, programs and apparati of the county? So could you just address that in general, the role of this NC plan and the broader goals of the community?
One of the things that was most notable to me about this particular NC plan was that there were over 60 recommendations. A third of those were recommendations for the Civic Association to do. So I thought that was impressive. And then the other two-thirds were things that were recommendations that included, that would include work on behalf of the county. I think one of the things that Tim also mentioned earlier was that our main role in this is to connect the residents and the Civic Association to the appropriate agencies in the department. So we'll facilitate that dialogue about the different things that the neighborhood will be pursuing that are recommended in the plan. So yes, I think they are very well equipped. And I mentioned the recommendations for the Civic Association because they've already done a tremendous amount of work and are continuing to do a tremendous amount of work, as opposed to another civic association that may be looking for the county to do everything or to solve all of the issues. So.
Okay, very, very well, thank you.
And just to add to that, I'm sorry.
Sure.
So once the plan is accepted by the county board, then the real work starts. I think for us with NC staff, we have a planner assigned to each neighborhood that participates in the program, and they'll start to work with the neighborhood to come up with different project ideas, and they can sort of be the liaison between the neighborhood and the county to explore some of the things that we can do in the future.
Sure, and that is the critical link to specifically the NC program. I think my comment was that there are a lot of recommendations here that perhaps extend beyond what the NC plan, notwithstanding Commissioner Scholl's comment. I will say that, Commissioner Scholl, that to the extent that we were going to explore as a county some kind of pilot project or a first time look at a major solar installation with battery, I think we'd want to make sure that we'd want to find the right site for that. So this may or may not be the best site for that, but the idea is that it's an idea worth pursuing and taking up, and whether that's through the NC program or through other avenues, I'd like to think that to the extent that this is the interface that this neighborhood has with the county, that you guys are helping them to reach out, and that's what Ms. Brown-Henry confirmed for me, so I appreciate that we're making those connections. Commissioner Gearin, I think you had another question earlier.
I did, thank you, and thank you for clarifying that. I had those same issues, so it's very heartening to know that you will be helping them shepherd this process through implementation. My concerns have mostly to do with safety, particularly recommendations 11 and 13, where attention has been drawn to documented problems with traffic pedestrian safety, but yet it sounds like we don't have a plan in place or a method to move forward. And the response is, I just wonder if we can talk about those a little bit. So for example, recommendation 11 notes that Little Falls is an arterial, so it's not appropriate for vertical measures for traffic calming. What are some of the other measures that they could look into? Do we ever overlook that and say, well, traffic calming is really important here, even though this is an arterial? And then with 13, the study to lower the speed limit. This is part of a larger issue that I feel like we revisit a lot when we look at the county's policies to encourage walking and biking, especially for children to school, but yet we don't have all of the pieces in place to make it as safe as we should. And when we get something like such a thoughtful plan, supported by staff, that has called attention to these issues, I'm really uncomfortable leaving these here saying, well, we don't have any timeline to study these in the short term. So what can you tell me about that?
Regarding the first recommendation about Little Falls Road and arterial, it is true that because it's an arterial, it's not eligible for vertical measures, basically speed humps. But there are other things that we have in our toolbox that we can use to as sort of traffic calming and traffic management to help make the roadway a safer place, and that's something we can absolutely work to help facilitate with the neighborhood if they wanted to do a project there. And we would work with DES to come up with some ideas that they could do on that roadway. But there's nothing we can do about the fact that it is an arterial, and we're pretty limited in what we can do in terms of some of the traffic calming measures. But regarding the speed study, I think the onus will be on NC staff and the neighborhood to work with DES and just ask our Transportation Engineering Operations Bureau to do a speed study. That is something they can absolutely do, and they should be able to do fairly quickly. So we get those requests on a regular basis, and as long as they have the resources, they move forward with that. So
Thank you. So I guess that's a little bit different than how I interpreted it. It sounded like this was done based on staff responses, but in fact, it's not. It's an ongoing process, and you'll be working with them to find appropriate resolution to the issues that were raised. Thank you.
yes.
Commissioner Ricks. I'm not sure your mic is,
Pushed it, but it's, okay.
thank you.
For planning issues that may be outside of the scope of the NC plan, I was curious, is there an example of a community like this creating a homeowners association to actually create an overlay that for building regulations that are more restrictive than what current zoning allows?
Well, that would be a question for staff. I'm certainly not familiar with one, but
I'm not familiar with one either, but it's something we'd have to follow up on.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Giacomini, I can't resist. I'm dying to ask you.
You know, that's a fascinating question. We do have in our zoning ordinance several types of overlay districts. As Mr. Ricks is familiar with, of course, would be the historic district overlay, which in many ways would act in the same way, because the historic district is combined with a set of guidelines that are adopted that actually speak to what is regulated within the local historic district. So while most of us know Maywood, there's a particular set of guidelines that addresses whether, it's additions, it's materials, it's of course not the color of the house, and nor is it limiting a size of an addition. But you could also write guidelines that just say you want to regulate the height, or you want to regulate building materials or the facade as it appears from the street, or any right-of-way, meaning if people want to put decks on the back, they don't have to come for a certificate of appropriateness to HALRB. The difference there is it's not the neighborhood that's deciding, it's HALRB. And in fact, would permit in some cases, doubling of the size of homes, which we've seen in Maywood, which respects, as I think the neighborhood thoughtfully said, there's a consumer desire to have some larger houses. But what you're looking for is appropriateness and sort of a way to blend styles so that you don't have this huge house, a little house, or that you have some stylistic similarities within the neighborhood that ties you together. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to say, no, there's not the provision in our zoning ordinance to do just an overlay by homeowners. I don't even know if we have enabling legislation to do that, since we're a Dillon rule state, right, which translates to mother may I, that we always have to ask the state if we can do something, rather than just assuming we can. But there is that tool of the historic district overlay that could be tailored to a particular neighborhood's needs and desires.
And just because I was asked by, actually had a few comments recently about the use of acronyms here. So just for those playing along at home, HALRB is Historic Affairs Landmark Review Board. Commissioner Riggs, did you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, the vehicle I was really thinking of was something where the homeowners created the HOA, and they have to enforce it. And I don't know if Arlington has that, and if
Do, that's what I was saying.
typically condos and co-ops, they always have them. But I wasn't aware if, outside of Arlington, I know certainly in newer neighborhoods, they're frequently present, but I'm not sure if we have it.
Sure, and I think that Commissioner Siegel wants to comment on this, and I guess I should revise my earlier comment. I know that we have HOAs, but therefore they're generally for like townhome developments and new construction that is consolidated. I mean, in terms of overlaying that on an existing established neighborhood is something that I'm not aware of. But go ahead, Commissioner Siegel.
So I'm just bursting to tell you that I am aware of and live next to a homeowner association that includes 9 single-family homes on 19th Road South that bends over Arlington Ridge Road and down to 20th Road South. There are 9 homes. The reason, the sort of political or development reason that this homeowner association exists is because the developer came in and requested that the open space required for each home be pooled. And there is in the back of these homes a 1 to 2 acre 1 to 2 acre land that is really not developable. So that was the impetus for the creation of this homeowner association. I just want to point out that there does exist a homeowner association for 9 single-family homes, and there may be others in Arlington.
Mr. Gutschall, if I could follow up just briefly, I believe what Commissioner Siegel was describing was a group of homes that was created under the zoning ordinance under the cluster designation. And so that type of development is handled differently from the beginning. It's almost like a site plan in a residential neighborhood, and cluster was based on the provision of a lot of open space. Cluster is not used much anymore. The next thing that was developed was unified residential development, where you could place single-family houses in different ways. And again, there is one adopted ordinance that covers whatever houses are done under the URD or under the cluster. So it essentially makes them like a homeowners association, but it's not technically that.
So I think we do need to move on. I think thank you, Commissioner Riggs, for raising the issue, because I do believe that this neighborhood is not alone in its desire for some kind of tool, if you will, or some sort of response to the changes that are going on. And Commissioner Lantomi commented on the 20% tear down rate in this neighborhood. Personally, I think that would probably be fairly consistent across most of North Arlington. And in fact, in some specific areas, specific pockets, even higher. And so that's anecdotally. So my comment to follow up on this to staff would be to look at the response to recommendation number 2 on in the staff matrix here on page 23. That is getting at some of these. There's really actually a couple of these recommendations that go 1, 2, and 3. That get at the heart of this issue of the character of the neighborhood, zoning, land use, and housing, and perhaps see if there's not, again, going back to the notion of that the role of this plan and this process is to connect the neighborhood with ideas and alternatives, whether or not there's not the potential for some discussion between the neighborhood and the appropriate planning staff of looking at if there really is a will from the neighborhood at exploring whether or not there is not some possibility under state law. I mean, they would have to all voluntarily, and how that breaks out down the road remains to be seen. But I think revising the staff comment, other than just remarking on what we've done in the past with the zoning ordinance, looking at other than zoning ordinance options, what would be there. Commissioner Weir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a preface, what I'm about to say, please, should be understood as being in no way, shape, or form directed to the presentation that we've gotten of the Williamsburg neighborhood. But as a historical comment, I would remind the chair and my fellow commissioners that things like CCNRs or creating new homeowners associations have an illustrious and storied history in swinging exactly the opposite direction from what we are talking about in terms of how neighborhoods can use them to keep certain kinds of people out or limit density in a way that our policy and planning explicitly seeks to avoid. So again, please don't hear me as saying anything with respect to the Williamsburg neighborhood specifically, but to the extent that we start talking about this, we have to remember that this axe swings both ways.
That is absolutely a valid point, and I think nothing in my comments should be construed as to suggest anything other than this would require a very extensive discussion and conversation, not the least of which would be among the neighborhood itself, but certainly in the county. I do, however, think that it's worthy of at least a conversation between planning staff and the neighborhood at what all would be involved if they were going to pursue this. Commissioner Giacomini.
Just to follow on, and what struck me is that I swear that in a couple of other NC plans that have come before us in the last 4 years, that there have been similar recommendations by neighborhoods. So, and I'm not sure that it's appropriate for the neighborhood services staff to do it, but it would be interesting to go through NC plans and find out how many of them talk about the neighborhood changing and lot coverage and height, and reviewing that and using that in some ways to help inform the CPHD work program for a coming year. There might, and again, that's sort of a balance, is you don't want one set of staff gathering data that tells another set of staff that maybe you need to do this work. But for NC and its officers itself, or someone there, it actually might be good to aggregate that and bring it forward, or let us know, or somebody that will be at the table for when we discuss the work plan. Because unless there are a lot of people that are interested in it, it's not going to be put on the work plan. And I think NC plans are so thoroughly vetted, so well written, researched. You've done all of the outreach that should carry some weight.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Giacomini. Any other questions on this? Commissioner Schroll.
Our chair mentioned how detailed this was and how this kind of went beyond some of the NC plans we've seen. I know as we kind of asked you some questions, you're taking some of these questions back to other staff. To the extent we start to see plans that are this elaborate going forward, I think it would be helpful to have some of your other colleagues from the other departments here, because some of our questions that I think I would have wanted to have asked, Mr. McIntosh and Ms. Brown-Henry, you are not the individuals to field those questions, and some of the things our chair just walked through, I think, would be questions for Mr. Duffy or some of his colleagues in the planning department or others, or DPR staff, and we keep going down the line. So I appreciate you fielding our questions tonight, but I think as we go forward, I think that would be helpful for our kind of consideration as well.
Yeah, actually, I hear where you're coming from, Commissioner Schroll. I think that maybe staff would like to, just one more time for the record, or to elaborate on your earlier answer in terms of the role of this plan in the greater scheme of things and what we're doing tonight. Because, and what I'm getting at, and I'll lead the question just a little bit here, is that there is nothing in this plan that becomes, binding in any way or anything like that. And so, so staff, would you just address that, how this plan is and how it's accepted by the county board and what that means?
Yep, I think you captured it correctly, that the NC plans are accepted by the county board. They're not adopted, so the county is not legally obligated to do anything in the plan. But we have been doing these plans for a long time, and we know enough that they do carry a lot of weight, and the county does put a lot of I think they review them carefully when we're doing development projects in the county. So I think it's an ongoing thing that continues to inform and help the county on development matters as we move forward, whether it be related to site plans or park projects, anything that's pertinent to the neighborhood. So it helps guide us, and I think it's very helpful for the neighborhood too.
All right, thank you, Mr. McIntosh, for that answer. Commissioner Schroll, would you like to give us a motion?
Sure. I move that the Planning Commission recommend that the County Board adopt the attached resolution to accept the Williamsburg Neighborhood Conservation NC Plan update, subject to the staff comments specified in the plan contained in the staff report dated May 21st, 2017.
Second, Commissioner Lantelmi. All right, any discussion, any amendments? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Opposed? Carries unanimously. And thank you to the neighborhood for great work, and to staff for all that you do. It really shows that you're able to come in with a nice, clean presentation, so thank you. All right, with that, Madam Clerk, would you please call the next item?
Item number 2 is ZOA-2017-01, amendments to the Arlington County zoning ordinance regarding signs. We have Debbie Albert here to present from planning staff.
Welcome, Ms. Albert. How are you?
Good evening.
Thank you for waiting patiently.
Should I
Go
start?
ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So this is a proposed zoning ordinance amendment that would revise the regulations for calculating sign area for projects that have retail. Configured. The proposed amendments were triggered based on some requests by a number of the county board's advisory groups and commissions, as well as members of the development community who had asked the county board to direct staff to consider how sign area is allocated in mixed-use projects. That led us to review the formula for calculating aggregate sign area for 2 specific configurations where retail uses face public parks and plazas, as well as where retail is located on both the first and second story of a building. Other requests, there's one other request that was made by members of the development community that we were able to capture as part of this proposed amendment, and that is increasing the maximum allowed size for blade signs, which we threw in here as we thought it would be something that we could look at without extending the scope of the proposed amendment. So just a little bit of background on how sign area works for mixed-use properties. There is a longstanding formula in the zoning ordinance for calculating sign area for buildings in commercial and mixed-use districts. This formula was based on longstanding practice, and in 2012, when the sign regulations were comprehensively updated, this formula was codified in the zoning ordinance. It allocates sign area for buildings in commercial mixed-use districts, so these are all C districts as well as industrial districts. It allows 1 square foot of sign area for each foot of linear building frontage. That linear building frontage is basically calculated as any frontage of the building that's facing a public right-of-way. It is calculated based on a straight line from building corner to building corner. It doesn't add additional sign or additional length to that line when there is an inset, such as a plaza, as shown in the building here. So in this example, this building from corner to corner, it's 200 feet long, so this building would be allocated 200 feet of sign area. In addition, however, the adopted formula also allows each retail or each business in the building to get at least 60 feet of sign area added into that calculation if it has less than 60 feet of frontage, as long as that business has an exterior public entrance directly into that establishment. So I just want to also add that that formula, while it does sort of look at individual businesses as part of calculating the formula, what it does is it calculates the amount of sign area that's allocated to the entire building. So even if a particular storefront, for example, doesn't add very much sign area to the total formula, the property manager or property owner has the authority to be able to, under a comprehensive sign plan, allocate that sign area any way he or she chooses throughout the development. So he can choose to give all the sign area to one retailer and none to others. That's probably not what they're going to do, but to allocate it accordingly. So the property manager controls that. It gives that property manager flexibility to allocate signs in the way that would work best for that building. So that includes both your retailers, if there's an office building, an office tower, or a residential tower, it might have a lobby that would have some signs, and any other signs needed for the property. That all comes out of that formula. There are also several examples in the county of developments. In addition to developments that have plazas, there's also several examples in the county of developments that have more than one story of retail. So again, these are the things we're looking at as part of this. These are the types of things, these plazas, often called for in our sector, small area and revitalization plans. A few examples shown on this slide here. These are the types of buildings we were looking at and helping to inform the proposed regulations before you tonight. A number of things that we looked at as part of our analysis. First, we looked at the Arlington County Retail Plan, which was adopted by the County Board in July of 2015, and looking at some of the policies articulated in that plan, including the 2015 Retail Plan really kind of rethought the way retail is spread throughout the county. It reduced the number of streets planned for retail, capitalizing on a synergy created by clustering retail uses next to each other. It recommends transparent storefronts to provide views into buildings, and it also articulates that really successful retail does best when it is associated with a well-designed and planned and functional public realm. So that led staff to factoring the amount and location of retail into the general formula for allocating sign area to our mixed-use properties. The second thing we looked at as part of this amendment was in October of 2016 as part of its implementation of the Roslyn, or not part of, simultaneously with the implementation of the Roslyn Sector Plan, the County Board adopted an amendment to the Master Transportation Plan which articulated two new street typologies, the shared street and the pedestrian priority street. These are street typologies that focus on pedestrian activity, public realm, and placemaking, ranging from a travel-free corridor, car-free corridor, to one that's more shared. These are two new street typologies in the Master Transportation Plan, and we wanted to think as part of this amendment about how those new street typologies work in conjunction with the formula for allocating sign area to mixed-use properties. Third, we looked at a number of site plan developments that have been approved in the county over the last 10 years. This is just the list of the top 20, I think. And we looked at the amount of retail associated with those amendments. I didn't necessarily put this table up here so that you can memorize the numbers, but just to give you a sense of sort of the range of amount of retail and the configuration of that retail, where there's more than one story of retail, where there's a public park or plaza associated with that amendment. We used these adopted site plans to help inform the proposed amendment to help understand the types of developments to which the sign area allocation formula would need to apply. And part of the reason, in addition, that we looked at this formula, you'll recall back in the fall, the county board adopted special provisions for sign area for regional shopping centers. In that case, staff had developed sign regulations that were specific to a very specific type of development. In this case, we wanted to get a sense of whether we needed to have sort of specific regulations. When we did this review of site plans over the last 10 years, what we found was that retail, mixed-use buildings, public plazas are really located throughout the county. And so it would best be served by a formula that included some specific criteria to capture a specific form, but to be applied to the formula as these criteria exist throughout the county. We established some goals of the proposed amendment. One was to factor in retail storefronts. As retail is strategically planned and located and clustered throughout the county, as shown in the Arlington County Retail Plan. Second, to emphasize how retail interacts with the public realm and the placemaking aspect of ground floor retail. And finally, we wanted to look at this formula and ensure that we're providing both an appropriate amount of sign area for mixed-use developments without providing an excess of sign area. So we wanted to achieve the right balance. So I'm going to start, I've switched around this presentation a little bit because the blade sign discussion always gets lost in the retail sign area formula. So before we get into the nitty-gritty details, staff is proposing to increase the maximum size of blade signs allowed in commercial mixed-use and industrial districts. Currently, the maximum allowed size sign for a blade sign is 20 square feet. With a comprehensive sign plan, an applicant could have up to 35 feet on longer facades, so where they have 70 linear feet of street frontage. These are still intended to be retail signs. These are signs that are placed below 40 feet, but this just gives people a little bit more flexibility to be a little bit more creative with their blade signs on longer frontages if they choose. So the next piece of the proposed amendment gets at revising that formula for calculating the total amount of aggregate sign area assigned to a commercial mixed-use building. So this just applies to C districts, not to industrial districts. It also would not apply to the 5 zoning districts, C1R, C1, C10, C2 and C010 that are typically associated with service commercial uses on the general land use plan. These properties have lower densities. They tend not to be mixed or less likely to be mixed use. They're narrower properties. They're closer to residential districts. They're not typically going to be associated with site plans or with necessarily with public plazas. So they're excluded from these proposed amendments, but these would apply to all other commercial mixed-use districts. Under the proposed amendment, the sign area formula would be revised to allow additional sign area. So in addition to the 1 square foot of sign area per foot of linear building frontage for 3 different situations, any or all of which could occur separately. First, it would allow 1 additional square foot of sign area for any portion of a building facade fronting a shared or pedestrian priority street that is designated in the master transportation plan. Second, it would allow an additional 1 square foot of sign area for any portion of a building facade. And in all these cases, these are for facades that actually contain retail. So you would only get the additional sign area if there is retail on these facades. An additional square foot of sign area for any portion of a facade that contains retail fronting an area meeting the following criteria. This is designed to get at parks and plazas. The word park and plaza is not defined in the zoning ordinance. We all know what it is when we see it, but when we write zoning language, we need to come up with some specific criteria so that we're clear and so that an applicant is clear as to when they are going to be eligible for this additional sign area. Staff has proposed that additional sign area would be available when a building is either, or a site plan, is either providing an unenclosed park or plaza that is shown on an adopted sector small area or revitalization plan, or providing a plaza that is located as required by an approved site plan condition. In addition, either whether it's shown in a plan or in an approved site plan, that plaza is proposed to be required to be publicly owned or have a public access easement in order to be eligible for that additional sign area. And again, this really gets back to ensuring that the retail is fronting a real functional public realm, both from a design perspective as well as a programming perspective, and certainly, of course, from a public access perspective, which staff believes is provided by that public ownership or the public access easement. The third situation, which would allow additional sign area, is for any facade that contains retail on more than one story, so long as any of those retailers, like the existing formula, have an exterior public entrance that goes directly into that establishment. And I'll have some images to illustrate the 2 stories of retail a little bit more on a later slide. I do want to share with you, for those of you who were at the ZOCO meetings to review this, there is some additional language that the county board advertised as part of this proposed amendment as optional text, and I did want to share that with you. Staff is continuing to recommend that the public access easement is required as one of the criteria for additional sign area facing a plaza, but I did want to share that the county board had advertised some additional language for its consideration and for your consideration that would sort of get at the same intent. And again, that is that the retail is fronting a very functional public realm, and that language included, so alternatively, staff's recommendation is in the small bullets in bold here, again, providing an unenclosed plaza and publicly owned or has a public access easement. The alternative language would require that plaza, it would keep this top portion here, be open to the public, is not separated from the building facade by an off-street parking area, has at least a portion at grade with the abutting street or sidewalk, and is contiguous with the public right-of-way. The other 2 provisions, the pedestrian priority street and the 2 stories of retail, were unchanged as far as what the board authorized for advertisement. Just a couple illustrations to illustrate the staff proposal. This image here is showing the same building I showed to illustrate the existing sign regulations, and you can see here also shown in red, under the adopted formula for sign area, this building gets 200 feet of sign area, shown in red here, just the distance from corner to corner. With the proposed amendment, this building has 2 stories of retail in some places, and I've just added over here, we have a 2nd-story office. Here we have a 2nd-story retailer that doesn't have an exterior door. It's got retail fronting the plaza on 2 stories. So this, and this illustration here shows that this plaza has a public access easement. So under this scenario, this same building, rather than getting the 200 square feet of sign area that it gets today, gets to 460 feet of sign area. That's adding in, the sides of the plaza and the one that you can't see here, as well as additional sign area for the 2nd story facing the street, the 2nd story facing the plaza, shown in green here, and then the other side of the plaza, or not the other side of the plaza, just this one. Just a second illustration showing kind of the difference as to what you would see if this plaza did not have a public access easement. In this case, this building's only going to get 370 feet of sign area. You'll notice that the difference is really only 90 square feet. Even though this plaza doesn't have a public access easement, this building is still getting credit. So this side of the plaza here is only 50 feet. Depending on how many retailers here there are here, but let's just assume it's 1. It has less than 60 feet of frontage, so it's going to get at least 60, even though it's not fronting a plaza with a public access easement. So I just want to emphasize that there are situations where even though you're not facing a public street or any of the areas that are proposed for additional sign area, there are still opportunities to gain additional sign area for the property. So even without the public access easement, this proposed building is getting 370 versus the 460. So it's really not a huge difference. And I just, this is all related to ground floor, basically retail type pedestrian-oriented signage. These are all signs that are required to be placed below a height of 40 feet. Signs placed above 40 feet are regulated separately, come out of a different formula for buildings that have a certain height, and they're not addressed as part of this amendment. Just a couple illustrations to illustrate how we're counting 2 stories of retail. We've got kind of 3 different scenarios here. Over on the right, just 1 story of retail. So this building is only getting credit for, in this case, it's 70 feet of frontage. Similarly, with this building in the middle here, there is a 2nd story of retail, but it is below grade. Under the proposed amendment, 2 stories of retail would be counted when there are 2 stories of retail that are at least 10 feet above grade. So on this middle building here, again, just credit for the length of the linear frontage, so 80 square feet. In this case, 3rd scenario, here we have 2 full stories of retail above grade, 60 feet of frontage, that would be multiplied by 2, so 120 feet for that building. And again, all 3 of these buildings could be part of the same comprehensive sign plan. Those numbers would all be added together. The property owner could allocate sign area to any of those areas that he or she chose. Just another example here, showing a building that has some elevation. So it has 2 stories of retail, and there are portions of it that are below grade, and there are portions of it, the ground story, that are above grade. Only in those portions of the building where there is at least 10 feet above grade would that 2nd story get additional sign area allocated it. So just for this portion here, and of course this building gets credit for all of its street frontage, regardless of whether or not there's retail on the ground floor. A couple other discussion items that came up during the ZOCO discussion, as well as during the county board public hearing on the request to advertise, that I wanted to share with you. There were some questions as to why not tie the amount of additional sign area allowed to the retail streets that are shown in the adopted Arlington County retail plan. Staff has not proposed to put this as part of the amendment. I wanted to talk about this a little bit. Again, the 2015 retail plan did some strategic rethinking on where retail should be allocated throughout the county. The plan articulates 4 different types of streets that have kind of different requirements in terms of, or guidelines in terms of the types of uses that are recommended for those streets. If the ordinance were to be tied to the retail streets in the retail plan, we'd have to do some additional thinking about which streets would be allocated additional sign area. For example, the green streets are really not retail streets at all, right? These are allowed any use under the zoning ordinance. It could just be ground floor residential or ground floor office. So that's an additional detail. Additionally, the proposed amendment is we've really tied it in our proposal to having retail fronting a well-designed public space, and that's what we've really been focusing on. Our sector plans moving forward in particular are really very well tied to our retail policies as well, so they are kind of tied in there in terms of where we have our public spaces. So we feel like that's already covered by the public spaces. And finally, the retail plan actually doesn't provide retail maps for all areas of the county. For example, Shirlington's not included. It's mainly the two major transportation corridors, Roslyn, Ballston, and Jefferson Davis, but there are other areas of the county that will not be captured through the retail plan. I've also got a few examples here, in addition to the sort of some real examples that you might be familiar with. This slide here shows the Central Place Plaza. The Central Place Plaza is, and this map here shows the adopted master transportation plan map that was adopted as part of the implementation of the Roslyn sector plan, showing that 18th Street, which actually goes straight through the plaza here, is now designated as a pedestrian priority street. Under the proposed amendment, the retail facing the Plaza, which is a pedestrian priority street, would get additional sign area. Just to orient you, Northmore Street and Lynn Street are on either side here. So normally these buildings would only be, or under the adopted provisions, these buildings would only be getting sign area for the sides of the buildings that face the public street. They are not currently allocated sign area facing that plaza. Under the proposed amendment, they would, because they are designated as a pedestrian priority street. In addition, and I don't have that information here, but if there is a second story of retail above those shown here, there would be an additional amount of square footage that would be added to that building. Another example, this is the building with the new Target in Roslyn, 2 stories of retail here. Under the adopted regulations, this building gets sign area for its street frontage. Under the proposed regulations, it would also get additional, it would basically double the amount of sign area for that frontage there because there are 2 stories of retail above grade. The Target, the second story, is accessible from directly from the street. Third example, also in Roslyn, this is showing the Roslyn Metro Center. Again, under the adopted formula, this building gets sign area for its street frontage facing, this is North Moore Street here. Under the proposed amendment, and again, showing the new master transportation plan map, with the pedestrian priority street designated here as 18th Street. If this building at some point in the future were to be reconfigured such that it had retail on this frontage, it does not currently, if it had retail on this frontage with its own entrance, it could get additional sign area under the proposed amendment for this frontage here. Another example, courthouse sector plan, again shown in green because these streets are not designated yet, but under the courthouse sector plan, there are recommendations to designate a number of streets shown in green as either pedestrian priority or shared streets. If those streets are designated as part of the implementation of the courthouse sector plan, and then these buildings have retail facing those frontages, additional sign area could be allocated under the proposed amendment that would not be allocated under the current formula. Market Common, 2 stories of retail. Currently, under the adopted formula, the only sign area allocated to this building is for that kind of the frontage that's facing Clarendon Boulevard. Under the proposed amendment, there would be additional sign area allocated for the sides, the retail on the sides facing the plaza, as well as for the second story. As you know, these retailers have exterior public entrances. You can go directly into them. They don't come off of a common hallway. I think this is my last example, Wellborn Square in Ballston. Sign area they get today, facing the streets on the sides of these buildings. Additional sign area would be allocated under the proposed amendment for those retail businesses facing the plaza. I just want to talk a little bit about Crystal City. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not the proposed amendment should require a public access easement, and as I said, staff is continuing to propose that public access easement. I think some of the main areas that have generated that discussion have been Crystal City. None of the plazas in Crystal City are either or neither publicly owned nor have a public access easement. They are all private. You can see here I have the map from the Crystal City sector plan showing the proposed open space in the long-range plan. The staff proposal to require a public access easement or public ownership for areas that are getting additional sign area around plazas is really right in line with the recommendations in the Crystal City sector plan. The Crystal City sector plan has a broad discussion of kind of how to create a real cohesive network of public open spaces in Crystal City, and one of the major recommendations in that plan is to achieve that through public ownership or access easements. And again, that's to really kind of distinguish between the public and private space and ensure that those spaces are not only kind of there in front of the retail, creating a good public realm, but are also programmed and accessible in a way that really works to, again, create that synergy that we're trying to create successful retail throughout the county. Lastly, a few organizational and clarifying amendments that are included with the proposed amendment. The proposed amendment moves some language around. There's some by right sign regulations. They're kind of buried under the wall sign provisions right now. That's not exactly the way they're administered. It's never the way they were intended to be administered. By right projects that don't have a comp sign plan also have access to a range of sign types. So we're just moving these regulations out of the wall sign provisions sort of up to the front, to be clear that it applies to multiple sign types for those buildings. And lastly, the definition for a foot of linear building frontage, which is sort of one of the major pieces of this amendment, is being moved. It's currently in the definition section at the end of the zoning ordinance. We're moving it into the measurement section of the sign regulations because that's the only place that it is used. Just a quick review of the public process. Staff reviewed the proposed amendments with the Zoning Committee of the Planning Commission twice in March and April, also with the Chamber of Commerce, the Commercial Real Estate Development Group, NAOP, as well as the Economic Development Commission Executive Committee. The County Board authorized the advertisement on May 20th, and the County Board will act on the proposed amendments at its meeting on June 17th. Staff's recommendation to the county board is that the county board adopt the amendments as proposed as attached to a staff report, again, requiring that public access easement for the criteria for a public plaza. And that concludes the staff presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Albert. Very thorough, as always. All right. Do we have any public speakers?
Mr. Evan Pritchard.
Mr. Pritchard.
So Ms. Albert teed me up. I'm sorry, I'm Evan Pritchard. I'm with the law firm of Venable. And Ms. Albert is implicating me in a lot of the discussions over Crystal City. I'm here on behalf of Vornado and JBG, which, as many of you or all of you probably know, are getting close to closing on an acquisition in which a new entity will be formed that will own all these properties, among others, that she showed in her slide for Crystal City with these private plazas. And as she went into a little bit in her presentation, these properties in Crystal City, again, as you're all aware, a lot of them were developed in the 60s when the practice was not to give public access easements to the county board. The Crystal City sector plan obviously envisions getting public access easement control over these properties. It's our belief and anticipation that that will absolutely happen as these properties are subject to major site plan amendments. There are a lot of practical difficulties in today just granting a public access easement. There are all kinds of liability issues, lender consent issues when there are multiple property owners in a vertical condo situation. You have to deal with those. You also have a situation where when you grant the county any kind of property right, such as an access easement, if in the future you have to come back and remove that easement or tweak it around the edges, you then have to go through the process of vacating all or a portion of those easements. That costs money and time. And so that's an additional reason why we would prefer the ordinance changes take place that she showed in her alternative slide without the public access or public ownership requirement for these plazas. It doesn't strike us as fair to subject the retail tenants in these plazas that aren't subject to a public access easement to the smaller signage amount just because there's not a public access easement. For any of you who live or visit Crystal City, you know a lot of these spaces don't have lines on the ground that say this is where the public access easement ends or does not exist, don't go here. They're perfectly accessible to the public, even though there's not a formal easement in place. They've retail in the storefront facades, and so they should benefit from the same sign treatment as plazas that are subject to a public access easement. The last point I want to leave you with is that as I said a moment ago, a lot of these properties we believe ultimately will become subject to public access easements. However, not all of the plazas and the parks that we're talking about today are on that public spaces master plan that was on slide 24, I believe. Some of them are existing private plazas that are going to be around for who knows how many years to come because these redevelopments take time. They're going to be in place, and they ought to have the benefit of the signage. I lied. My very last point is to the issue of, I believe Ms. Albert said that the reduction in signage in a practical sense in the example she gave would be 90 square feet. Well, from 460 square feet, that's a 20% difference. And when you're talking about some of these areas that have matured and have trees grown up and are tucked back, some of these retail spaces are going to remain, and 20% signage differential is something meaningful in a lot of those cases. So I'm happy to stick around if you have any questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the speakers.
We have one more. Mr.
sorry.
Walker?
Good evening. I'm James Walker. I'm with American Real Estate Partners. And on behalf of my firm, I want to say that we generally support the amendment. We think it's a very good change to the policy in the county. As you all know, upper story retail struggles mightily. And anything that we can do as a community to strengthen the visibility and the accessibility of second floor retail, I think we should be doing. I think the amendment as proposed is too narrow in two important ways. One, with respect to the requirement that upper floor retail have its own separate entrance. I think this is an unnecessary restriction. I think that as long as the retail has some visibility, a street facade, what you're looking for is that activation, pedestrian activation on the street. And if the pedestrians can see the retail on the facade of the building, I think that's the kind of recognition and activation that you're looking for. There are many buildings that have retailers on an upper floor who share a common lobby. There are, for example, many lobbies that provide one elevator up to the upper floor retail. This amendment, if it was passed as it is, actually penalizes someone who puts in an elevator for access to the upper floors if they don't have a direct stair access to the street. So I don't think that's really what is intended by the policy of changing the signage regulations here. So I would encourage you to consider eliminating the requirement that the upper floor retail have its own distinct street entrance. I would also encourage you to think about not limiting this to just second floor upper retail. Again, it's uncommon, but we all know that there are places in the county that have third and fourth floor retail. That retail does have a very difficult time sustaining itself. And I think the county, again, to the extent that you have a retail establishment that has a number of floors of retail, again, that are on, that have facades, you have that clustering element that the county has recognized is important to the sustainability of retail. And so I think that, again, even if it's on the third or fourth floor of the building, I think that we should think about extending this signage bonus square footage to the retailers on those floors as well. It will still encourage additional pedestrian traffic and, more activity on the street, even if the retail is up a few stories, as long as the pedestrians can see a sign that that retailer is up there. So those are really the only two changes that I'm looking for, and I hope that you will consider that. I think they're very small changes, but I think they would be consistent with what the intent of the amendment is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I think that was the last speaker then, correct? Okay. Any other commissions here? Don't think so. So the matter is now before the Planning Commission. Commissioner Guerin, do you have a ZOCO report?
I do. I have a brief summary of our consideration of these issues to date. So again, these are amendments to the zoning ordinance to allow additional sign area for development projects in commercial or mixed use that contain retail uses in certain configurations. ZOCO met March 29th and April 26th to consider these changes. Ms. Albert, thank you so much for your very thorough and precise and thoughtful consideration at those meetings and with the report too. This is very complicated information. You did a really good job with the illustrations and explaining it. So Ms. Albert presented at those meetings, and as she pointed out, at additional meetings when we've received some feedback regarding the proposed amendments. And as background, the county has been working on retail signage issues and periodically reviews them. So the current proposed changes allow for greater retail signage. So for us to consider tonight, are these the right policies, the right changes, and does the proposed language in our reports implement the proposed policy changes? At our recent ZOCO meetings on the topic, issues that have been partially resolved in the staff report or that remain unresolved include defining parks and plazas. Commissioners Lantelmi and Schroll raised these at the ZOCO meetings. Page 11 in our report discusses how this was handled. Retail equivalent, Ms. Albert assures me that retail includes retail equivalent. The public access easement requirement for additional signage. I'll come back to that in a moment. How to interpret covered or roof. This was addressed by using the term enclosure because that is a defined term in the zoning ordinance. Concern that the second-story retail without a dedicated exterior entrance does not qualify for this additional signage, and not represented by any public comment tonight, there was some additional discussion about needing other types of signage in certain areas as they develop over time, such as wayfinding and monument signs. With regard to the public access easement requirement for additional signage, we did have some discussion about this at our ZOCO meetings. It is true that the Crystal City Sector Plan does address this pretty clearly and consistently. Starting with page 74, they talk about private open space may be perceived as less physically accessible. And then going into the specifics of moving forward, acknowledging that a lot of these properties were developed in the 1960s when it was not our practice to acquire public access easements, the plan does call for including a public easement dedication where applicable under the open space planning recommendations. On page 78, addressing the displacement of public open spaces, through the improvements to existing open spaces along with public easement dedications. And then again, later in the plan, action point number 23 talks about, in all cases, new or improved public open spaces will require public access easements. So just to give some more background as to what Ms. Albert was giving us in terms of trying to address this issue that was raised by the community. So to that end, I feel like those are some of the major issues we may want to discuss tonight, as well as others.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we will open it up. Commissioner Guerin, did you email around that report?
I did not.
Okay, I just want to make sure I hadn't missed it. So having said that, can you, let's just go through the short list of of the major topic points that you're suggesting?
Well, let's start with defining parks and plazas and see if Commissioners Lantelmi and Schroll were pleased with how that was resolved since they raised that as their
Let's do definitions in general. Okay, what else?
retail equivalent.
That would be part of definitions.
Yes, and reference earlier on was to covered or roofed, and we're now using the term enclosure, which is precisely defined in the zoning ordinance.
Definitions.
That's also in definitions. And then the outstanding issues were well defined by the speakers tonight. The public access easement requirement for the additional signage and concern that second-story retail without the dedicated exterior entrance does not qualify for this additional signage.
Okay,
as well
so,
as others.
right, so I have definitions, the public access easement, and then the second story, and actually second story and above, provisions, shall we say. All right, and then we will have a catch-all others. All right, so let's start with definitions. Question about definitions in the zoning ordinance, proposed zoning ordinance amendment. Commissioner Shelby.
I have a general question. When we're talking about retail signage, is it all signage, like wayfinding and monumental as well?
So this is actually a formula for calculating sign area that's allocated to the entire property. So while the formula and the amendment that's proposed would add additional sign area when a property includes retail configured in a certain way, this isn't necessary. This isn't signs for retail. This is signs for the entire property, so it includes all signs.
Thank you.
Is that true? Does that include where it says the fire access, the connections are and the parking is over here?
There are, you're correct, there are certain signs. So the way the sign ordinance works is there are certain signs that kind of count as part of that. So say you do your math and you end up with 100 square feet for a property, there are certain signs that count against your aggregate sign area, that 100 square feet, and there are other signs that are sort of free. They don't count. So Mr. Lantelmi is correct that there are so incidental signs, which are signs that are non-commercial and less than square feet. So that may be a sign that says, exit, fire access or whatever, as long as it's smaller than 4 square feet and doesn't have any commercial content. That doesn't count against that 100 square feet. The other signs that don't count against that 100 square feet are window signs. They're sort of freebies. You can cover a certain amount of the window, but they don't count against that. Most other signs are going to count, and certainly any sign that's commercial will count against that 100 square feet.
All right. Commissioner Hughes.
Sure, I just want to follow up just to clarify with Ms. Albert. Again, I want to remember and remind, form-based code's not included in these amendments, correct?
Correct. Form-based code has its own sign regulations that are very different.
Right. And do we have any plans, if you don't mind, Commissioner Gutschall, to follow up, do we have any plans to review the sign ordinance within the form-based code to ensure that it's either equally generous or is consistent with this change?
There's nothing planned right now, but it's certainly something that could be raised through the form-based code advisory working group, but there's nothing planned.
All right. Commissioner Weir.
So just to follow up on the Commissioner Shelby's question, do I understand you correctly that the blue parking sign has to be less than 2 by 2 in order to not count against the total square footage?
The blue parking sign actually has special rules. So that blue parking plan sign was established as part of a sort of a county wayfinding system. It's allowed to be a little bit larger than that, and I think maybe someone just put it in front of you. It's a little bit bigger than 4 square feet.
Thank you.
For that particular sign.
Other questions about definitions? And I actually, if this was raised at our zoning committee, I actually am interested, Ms. Albert, the definition of retail. It's not in the list of definitions that was included as part of this, but that is defined.
So retail is not specifically defined. It is articulated in the use classification system in the zoning ordinance, which provides examples. So the use classification system for retail has 3 segments. So sales and service, or sales, service, and repair, 3 different types of retail. Those are the only, and the examples provided under that are the things that you would expect. So like watch repair, books. The things that you would expect to find under those categories are the only things that are actually defined as retail. But the proposed amendment allows this additional sign area for any frontage that includes a space approved for retail. So the way, the word retail equivalent never shows up in the zoning ordinance, right? That's a term that's defined and articulated in the Arlington County Retail Plan. A retail equivalent is a use that sort of looks, acts, and functions like retail. If it does that, meaning it's open the same hours, it has transparency like retail does, and it's functioning in all the ways that we expect retail to function, then the zoning administrator can approve that use in a space approved for retail. So the same use, like if it's only open 3 hours a day, may be allowed as a retail equivalent in one location, but not in another. I just said that backwards. If it's open the hours that retails are open, it can be approved as a retail equivalent. So by saying that this is allowed in spaces approved by retail, it would capture businesses that are retail equivalents that are approved to be in that space.
Is that, would that only then apply to site plan projects, or do we have spaces that are approved for retail use that might not be?
The zoning administrator can approve a retail equivalent in any space that's allowed to have retail, so regardless of whether it's a site plan or a by right project. If it, again, if it looks, acts, and functions like retail.
So even a by right commercial establishment, like an old strip mall, say, that has retail in it, if it was approved for a retail equivalent, that would still...
I believe so, but for the purposes of this amendment, an old strip mall is probably going to be in like a C1 district. It's not going to be eligible for this additional sign area anyway.
Fair point. So what I really want to understand is, as we evolve, hopefully with time, and our definition of retail and retail equivalents and the way that we're using our ground floor spaces, as that evolves, is it your premise, staff's premise, that the way the amendment is written, by referring to retail sort of in this broadly defined use, that would capture the, as our definition of retail moves forward, evolves, this would capture that?
I mean, the amendment refers to a space that's approved for retail, so it really gets more at what the county board has approved it for than what's actually in there. If it's approved for retail, what's in there is either going to be a retail use specifically, or it's going to be something that functions and looks like retail.
Okay. All right. Any other questions about definitions? Commissioner Schroll?
I don't have a question, but I know Commissioner Guerin asked if I was happy with the way we landed on the definition for parks and open space. I don't know if Commissioner Lantelli wants to weigh in here as well. I'm happy with where we landed with respect to definition, and I'm also happy with where we landed with respect to the public access easement issue as well.
Okay, thank you.
I'll concur with Commissioner Scholl on the definition of public space. As far as the public access, I'd rather go with the additional language as was advertised, the alternative language.
Okay, well, we're getting ready to, actually, then we will segue to that issue having to do with the public access easement, the sort of this notion, the idea of staff's proposed language and then the alternative language that was also advertised by the board, and I think that is favored by the public speakers and some of the other written testimony that we had submitted to us. Commissioner Siegel.
So could we, are we ready for that issue?
Yes, we are.
Could we get that slide up again and take a look at it? 20.
No, this is it.
I just if I could jump in for a minute, that second bullet in purple where it says private, that's not in the zoning language, so disregard that. The bullet's there, it's just the parenthetical remark that says private.
Okay.
That's not in the proposed language, so you can disregard that.
Okay,
You
Commissioners.
may want to actually refer to your staff report on page 2 of attachment A, not labeled. So this language is starting on line 54. If you want to see the exact language, this is sort of the plain English version of it.
Very well, and so Commissioner Siegel, you have the floor.
I actually just wanted you perhaps to just go through how you summarized this slide. You said that the so provides an unenclosed park or plaza shown in an adopted sector, small area revitalization plan, or an unenclosed park or plaza located as required by an approved site plan condition. That, how are we to read the, I thought you, can you just go through what you said? I really was confused by it.
Sure. Staff's proposal.
Staff's proposal is in black.
Staff's
All of that
proposal is in black.
And the alternative
The
is
alternative is in purple. But what I will also add is that the county board advertised this bullet that staff is proposing as optional.
Okay.
So it could
That
be
was my
included or not included,
Okay, okay.
in addition to advertising all of these as optional.
Perhaps, Ms. Albert, I could jump in here, and I would like to ask, could you sort of address directly the arguments that we heard, again, from the public speakers tonight and in our written testimony, the letters that have been submitted, the notion of that there are lots of public spaces that don't have public access easements, and why are we sort of conflating easements with signage? Could you just address sort of very directly that staff's thinking on why an easement? So what we would basically be saying is if you don't currently have an easement and you are interested in the additional sign area that would be afforded by this zoning ordinance amendment, that then we would want those property owners to come in with a site plan amendment to add an easement, or how would that work?
Yes. So just sort of starting with staff's intent with this amendment, one of the goals that we've articulated for this amendment is to really tie the sign area allowed for retail and our configuration and regulation of retail throughout the county with retail plan policies and with our public open space policies. The 2015 retail plan articulates, and what we're trying to further emphasize with this amendment is that successful retail is predicated not just on having signage and visibility, but also on being associated with a very successful and well-functioning and well-configured public realm. So as part of this amendment and the additional sign area, staff is really marrying those two ideas to ensure that the retail is accessible for a range of reasons. And it's really going to be successful when we have a successful place. This is emphasized in the Crystal City Sector Plan for the same reasons. It's emphasized in the Arlington County Retail Plan. Staff put a lot of thought into this, and also in sort of helping the county board come up with some of this additional language that does try to get to some of the same intent. Where staff has landed at this point is really to still continue to propose that public access easement for the reasons I just discussed in terms of consistency with adopted policies, and consistency particularly with the Crystal City Sector Plan, which is probably the best example of the county of areas where we have plazas that are really privately owned. What we think is that by not requiring the public access easement, you're going to inadvertently capture a bunch of areas that are just unintended, more so than you're going to miss out on areas that don't have public access easements. And I guess I would also add that sort of kind of moving forward and really looking backwards for the last 10 years, the county has consistently required public access easements or public ownership over these spaces that are planned public spaces shown in our sector and small area plans, but also some that aren't. So for example, the plaza at Marymount, which as you know, for those who worked on that project recently, that was in an unplanned area. It wasn't captured in an area plan. It went through a special GLUP study. And that public plaza associated with that building had a lot of sort of public effort put into it in terms of the design. It has a landscape plan requirement, again, to ensure that that plaza is going to be really well functioning, as well as accessible to the public. When you don't have a public access easement, that plaza could be closed at any time and not accessible to the public. And lastly, I guess I had another point.
Could you address the issue of the difficulty of adding an easement where there is none? Mr. Pritchard spoke this evening about cost and legal ramifications and all that. What is?
Yeah, and there certainly are costs associated with adding an easement. In addition, the county does not charge for granting an easement. I mean, certainly the county's not going to grant an easement in an area where we're not interested in having an easement, but if the county's interested, there's no charge for that easement. There is, however, there's a plat review that's required. There's a charge for the review of the plat. It's a $330 charge per plat. It's a process that takes, that review is a couple months. If it's a easement that is not either required by an adopted site plan or in a subdivision, which isn't really as relevant here, it would also require county board approval, so there would be an additional board action. So certainly the applicant, if they have legal fees or legal advice associated with that, also required as part of the review of the plat, or as part of the plat review application would be a current survey. So if they don't have one, that applicant would probably reach out to a third party and there would be a fee associated with that, which I'm sure would vary. It's not something that the county does. So there are costs associated, and as Mr. Pritchard indicated, if for some reason the property owner wants to vacate that easement, at some point there is a cost associated with the vacation of an easement. So there are certainly costs associated with that, but the way, again, sort of looking at sort of consistent practice in terms of how we regulate these types of properties moving forward, this is how we do it. And I would say that we ran into a similar issue in 2012 when we did a comprehensive update to the sign regulations. At that time, the process was that an applicant could sort of ask for anything they wanted that wasn't in the ordinance, and the county board could approve it. That doesn't exist anymore. So when we codified kind of administrative regulations for signs, we have over 400 comprehensive sign plans out there. We have over 400 site plans out there. We haven't consistently done things the same way for as long as the county has regulated land use. But in creating a zoning ordinance amendment, staff thinks it's prudent to sort of to create regulations that work moving forward in terms of how we regulate land. And because this proposal is consistent with a very involved discussion in the Crystal City sector plan, which sort of provides the example of the properties that don't quite fit this provision, we're comfortable moving forward with the requirement for the easement.
All right, well, thank you for that. Commissioner Guerin.
Those were my precise questions. How difficult would this be for someone wanting to come in now and get this public access easement recorded? And it sounds like there's a $330 fee to review the plat, plus whatever costs are necessary for the survey. And the survey is triggered if there hasn't been one within a certain time frame?
The survey is triggered as part of the plat application, so I think it's just in terms of whoever they hired to provide that survey, depending on what information they have.
And then a couple of months to review these documents and go before the board.
Right, so it's a minimum of a 3-month process. I will say that in my discussions with real estate, something like that is typically, once it gets to the board, a pretty easy process, often goes through on the consent agenda. Not guaranteed, obviously, but kind of once it's gone through the review, it's a pretty easy process in terms of the board approving something like that.
Thank you.
I think Mr. Harris heard you, so he took notes.
But that's not this, I don't think that's really.
Okay, Mr. Lantama, you have to seek recognition, please. Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Commissioner Gottschall. My first question is a follow-up to yours, and then a comment for us all to consider. First of all, I'll go with the comment. When we think about the cost, and I know Ms. Albert's got the filing fees for the county, we also have to remember that assumes two very important things. One, a single owner who owns their entire property outright without having to seek consent from either their investment firms, like banks, or their own investors. So as we think about the sort of process and mechanics an organization might have to go through that owns a $100+ million building, think about that sort of process, not only in doing it, but vacating basically your rights as an owner, which is what an easement does. But my question to Ms. Albert as a follow-up to Commissioner Gutschall's question is, you responded that our concern from staff was that we might have unintended consequences with the sign ordinance, which we almost always do every time we adopt one, which is why I don't like them very much. But have we done at all a comprehensive review of these areas outside of Crystal City that we're concerned might get captured if we were to expand the definition of public open space to include the private plazas we generously enjoy in Crystal City?
We do not have a definition of public open space. So just to clarify, and no, we have not. I mean, it would be impossible to do a comprehensive review of every place in the county where there is space that's open. We have not done that.
Then, follow Commissioner Gutschall, do you want? Without doing a comprehensive one, have we identified one or two examples of the appropriate zoning district with the plaza space, street frontage requirements that might show a visual example that might meet?
I don't have any examples to share with you. And again, I would say that that's not the major driving factor in terms of requiring the public access easement. I just went through a long list of policy of policies that are consistent with this proposal. So I would say that that's just one thing that we considered.
Okay.
All right. Commissioner Lantalmi.
Thank you. I agree with Commissioner Hughes. I think the cost isn't simply on the county side, which does seem to be fairly small for these large developments. It's on the property owner side. I think that the comments are fair, that the lender covenants have to be addressed. If you have multiple ownership, such as in a condo, you have to get the entire condo association on board or the co-op on board. It's not simple. It's going to take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of money. It's going to inevitably have to have legal review before it can be moved forward to the county side. It is a complex and probably fairly expensive proposition in order to get a few more signs. Either the signs are good or they're not, regardless of whether it's an easement, whether it's a public easement or it's privately owned. Do we want the signs or not want the signs? I don't see the nexus between the two.
So Commissioner Lantalmi, I think that what staff has addressed the issue for us, and so now it'll be among this commission whether you want to make a motion, and we can debate that amongst ourselves. But I wanted to save Ms. Albert from having to get into a debate with you on the specific, unless, was there an additional point you wanted to make, Ms. Albert?
I guess I do have two brief points, and I will try to be brief. I mean, one, the goal in these cases is to get public access easements over the spaces that are planned to be public spaces anyway. So this is just something that helps encourage property owners to come into consistency with that goal. The other thing that I would add is that there are other ways that these properties can access sign area. So for example, if a property has a really short street frontage and it's got two retailers on that short street frontage, under even the existing adopted formula, that property is going to get at least 60 square feet of sign area for each business in that building that has an exterior public entrance. So there are other ways, and that's sort of illustrated in the two diagrams that I showed. So getting the public access easement, you're right, may not be sort of from a cost benefit, it may not be the best way for them to take advantage of the sign area.
Thank you, Ms. Albert. Commissioner Weir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Albert, am I understanding you in general terms correctly that the principal concern with the open to the public proposal is that what's open might become not open at some point without an easement?
That is a concern, yeah. And I guess what I would pose to you all to think about is, what does open to the public mean? Is it 1 hour a day? Is it 1 day a week? What does that mean? And I guess I also want to add that this is proposed to be an administratively approved provision. So the zoning administrator needs to be able to look at this, and the idea here is to come up with really clear criteria. That makes it easy to administer, and it also creates an expectation for the property owner. The clearest way to do this is to require a public access easement. There's no debate there. Some of these other criteria are going to be a little bit, in some cases, it'll be real obvious, in other cases, it won't be. So in terms of setting kind of really clear, transparent expectations, it does get a little bit more challenging.
So if I may?
Sure.
Other than the administrative concerns that you just articulated, which may answer my question, what would be the additional burden on the county and perhaps even on the property owners to do something short of an easement, like a contractual arrangement that the county owners would present, would represent, that the property owners would represent a certain amount of openness, or that it would be open for a certain amount of time, or that it wouldn't be closed off to the public at some point in the future, that wouldn't actually be so rights surrendering as an actual easement?
I would say, I guess, that would probably come in the form of language in the zoning ordinance. And the open to the public could be qualified as 24/7 or something like that. I guess I can't speak to the legal options in terms of as to whether there's some other contractual arrangement. But again, I will add that the goal for the county and to create good public open spaces is to have that surrendering of rights that does come with the public access easement.
Okay, Commissioner Giacomini.
Thank you, Commissioner Gutschall. So I'm really, really clear. Currently, we allow signage at retail on plazas, whether they have a public access easement or not, right? There's no prohibition to this.
That's correct.
Right, and so what we're talking about in this amendment is getting additional signage. So right now, from the aggregate sign area, any landlord can assign sign space anywhere in the building.
That's correct.
In conformance with under 40 feet and all the rest of it.
Yes.
Okay. So we're talking about an extra. Many planning commissioners attended the SPRC on the Roslyn City Center, where we had quite an extensive discussion about how much public access easement, how big it should be for a second-story plaza that has retail fronting it. And I dare say that SPRC very much came down on the side that there should be full public access easement there. So I realize this is now, Crystal City was then, but I think we affirmed to ourselves through those discussions how very important having a public access easement over these plazas is, and that we have tools in our zoning code that allow signage, that allow outdoor seating, that everything. But what is public, what feels like the public realm and is part of the deal, needs to be that. So I very much appreciate Mr. Pritchard's testimony, and I heard, there are the liabilities, there's the vertical condo, there's the issues, as other commissioners have mentioned, that you have all these ownership entities, and I think, well, gosh, they still exist when we have a site plan come in, but sort of the difference there is we're in horse trading mode, right? We're into, well, they get a new building, okay, well, we'll give you a public access easement over this land that you've been using anyway. I get that, but if they want to help their tenant, their retail tenant, have extra signage, now this is, again, over and above what they can give them now, then maybe they need to be the ones to step up and do something for their tenants and go ahead with that easement, which they would be perfectly willing to do if we were in a site plan situation where they were asking for a ton of bonus density and getting a brand new building. So, I understand it, and I would argue vigorously if I were sitting not up here, but I am sitting up here. And so I'm thinking about the county as a whole and our public realm as a whole, and what we really expect and what our adopted policies are currently. So I'm comfortable with what staff has proposed.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Giacomini. I think Commissioner Ricks.
In a scenario where the second floor retail just isn't working for whatever reason, but this access easement has been granted. What happens in a scenario when the building owner wants to change the use of that space? And it's no longer appropriate for general public access. Are they restricted? Do they have to maintain?
Well, we can ask Ms. Albert to answer that. I will say that I need a little clarification on your question because you mentioned second floor retail, and that's actually our next topic we're going to talk about is the request for a different requirement in terms of access to second floor, meaning does it have direct access to the street or can it be through a common elevator? That's a different part of what we're talking about right now. The public access easement has nothing to do with first floor, second floor. It has just to do with whether it's fronting onto a plaza area.
I agree. I was just sort of responding to the discussion.
So do you want to ask staff a direct question about what happens if the retail use goes away?
Second floor simply because that could be more difficult. And so in a situation where you grant access easements, but over time, the building owner determines that the concept of retail is just not working and they want to change the use of that space. How is the easement impacting that decision?
So what I hear you asking, Commissioner Ricks, is it a quid pro quo? The easement is tied to the provision of signs. So if the need for signs or even the desire for signs goes away, does the easement go away?
Correct. And does it restrict, once things change, does it restrict the development use of the
Sure.
property?
Ms. Albert, would you like to answer?
So I'm having a little bit of trouble tying the second story retail to the public access easement, but let me try to answer the question in a different way and we'll see if this sort of gets at the point you're trying to make. Say you have second story retail, which under this proposed amendment also qualifies you for additional sign area. If at some point in the future that second story retail is not doing well, the applicant comes in and says, we want to change that second story to office, they go through a site plan amendment or an administrative change, and it's now no longer approved for retail, but you've been given extra sign area for it.
Also, if you've granted that owner has granted a public access easement on the plaza in order to
So if there's also a plaza in that situation, I don't know that the changing over of the second story retail would be a trigger for wanting to get rid of the public access easement, because you probably, if you have second story retail, you also have retail on the first floor. So
I think the second story example may have conflated the issue just a little bit. I believe, and now you correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Albert, I think that the answer to your question, Commissioner Ricks, is that the easement, once granted, is not tied to the signage or retail or anything. It will be an easement that is in perpetuity, and until the board then would approve vacating the easement for whatever reasons down the road, that easement is locked in. They are not linked to each other once the easement is granted.
that's correct.
Does that answer?
Yeah, that answers my question, but I just wondered if it limited the use of the property if they change from retail in the future.
It does not. Once the easement is granted, it's a public use easement, and any vacation of any abandonment of the retail use, to the extent that that would be a board action, and to the extent that there would be in the public interest to abandon the easement, then that would be something that the board can consider, but that would have to be its own process altogether. Essentially, once the easement is granted, it is there in perpetuity until the board and the property owner agree mutually that something else makes better sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to follow on, I think what Ms. Albert was trying to say is that the situation would probably be that it is a site plan building. And so you can't just get rid of retail. That means you have to go through a process, and depending upon the amount of it, it could be either a minor site plan amendment or a major site plan amendment that either comes through us and the board or just the board. And so during that discussion, there would probably be a weighing of, well, but there's a public access easement over this plaza, and we want it to be enlivened, so actually, we're not going to convert that retail space to office. We have that discussion perennially here at Courthouse. I think Commissioner Gutschall knows about how we use those retail frontages, and there's a public access easement here. So it would be part of a discussion.
Okay, so I think that we are now ready to take on more directly than the issue of the second story and above, and specifically, I think the testimony we heard. Actually, I heard two things. I heard one, couldn't there be some allowance for a commonly accessed elevator, for example, versus direct street stair access, onto the plaza? But also, actually, it's not just plaza; it's any access for the public directly to a second-story space, correct? But then the secondary issue was not only for second floors, but for third and fourth floors. I actually didn't realize we had fourth floor retail. I'm only thinking of like our regional shopping centers, and clearly this is not meant.
Just cast your mind back to Roslyn City Center, where there might be a.
Well, and I will confess, I've never shopped there.
No, but in the renderings and in the proposed new retail uses, I believe there might have been a fitness center. Is there something proposed for what would be considered fourth floor?
So staff, would you mind responding then directly to those specific requests? So third and fourth stories, and then also the idea of like an elevator, commonly accessed elevator access as opposed to direct from the street access.
Yeah, so starting with the direct access, I want to start with the adopted formula for allocating sign area today. The adopted formula for allocating sign area, I mentioned that if you have less than 60 feet of frontage and you have an exterior entrance, then as part of the overall sign area that you're allocated for that property, you can get at least 60 feet for any business in that building that has less than 60 feet of frontage, as long as it has an exterior entrance. So this is sort of carrying that concept forward. The reason we have that concept is because if you were to say you have an interior, whether it's a small mall or of retail that's accessed from an interior hallway, if you were to provide sign area for every single retailer, 60 feet of sign area for every single retailer in that building, you would end up with an excess amount of sign area for the property. One of the things we're trying to manage here is to provide an appropriate amount of sign area. And we're not trying to incentivize retail that is interior oriented. Again, everything we know about retail today and our retail policy really marries the idea of successful retail being married with a successful and functional public realm. Where there are interior retails, there's nothing that precludes the property owner from having signs for interior tenants on the outside of the building. As long as that business is in the building, it can have a sign. It just comes out of the sign area allocated for the property. And kind of throughout this exercise, I've been encouraging people to really think about this as sign area for a property. This is not sign area for this retailer and for this retailer and for this retailer. It is sign area for the property. The way we allocate sign area in Arlington is typical as far as the way sign area is allocated throughout the nation. 1 square foot of sign area per foot of linear building frontage is typical. It would be rare and unusual for interior tenants to be allocated their own sign area. We would just end up with an excess amount of signage. So similarly, we've tied that same concept to second-story retail. Second-story retail gets that extra 60 square feet of signage today. So by creating this extra additional sign area, it just means that second-story tenants that have long frontages may get more than the 60 square feet of frontage, again, as long as they are interacting with the public realm. As far as the second story, staff incorporated 2 stories of retail in this proposed amendment because we have a lot of topography in this county. The county's retail policy addresses ground floor retail. It doesn't encourage nor discourage second-story retail, and we do have it in a number of places. Because of the topography we have in the county, we have a lot of buildings that have, the first floor on one story is the second floor on another story. So on that other facade. On that other facade, you're going to have 2 stories of retail. This is the situation that we're trying to account for here, but we're not trying to encourage second-story retail necessarily. The retail plan doesn't do that. We're not trying to drive retail policy through sign regulations. It's really just acknowledging that second-story retail does exist in some places. These are signs that are placed below a height of 40 feet. And we do believe that what we're proposing here is a significant amount of additional sign area for a number of properties throughout the county, and that it is an appropriate amount of sign area for our mixed-use buildings.
Okay, let's stay on this before we get to the third and upper story issue. So a follow-up question I have is the Market Common. It was done under the old way that you described, where we had its own comprehensive plan that was part of the site plan, comprehensive sign plan. If it didn't have a comprehensive sign plan that was adopted as part of that site plan, and it was to be done under the existing rules, would it have excess sign area right now? In other words, did they get more sign?
I will tell you that I had a very hard time discerning how they calculated the amount of sign area that was applied to Market Common in, I think, 1999.
Right.
So it's very difficult to do that math. I can use a more recent example. I can use Penrose Square.
Okay.
Penrose Square has 2 stories of retail. It has a public plaza with a public access easement. Penrose Square actually has more sign area allocated today than it's using.
But Penrose Square also has more frontage on streets, doesn't it? Because
Penrose Square does have more frontage on streets, but I will add that Market Common is not just what you know of as Market Common with Crate and Barrel and Potty Barn. It's also a number of other buildings. So without
actually adds to its overall frontage. It has a lot of frontage.
Right. So a comprehensive sign plan can apply to one building or to a group of buildings, and the Market Common site plan incorporates more than just the shopping center. So without doing a detailed review of that site plan, I did review the staff report from 1999 that I think it was 99 that approved the sign area for that property, and it's difficult to articulate how they did that math and what it would get and how much frontage it had.
Well,
I don't have an answer for you.
I believe you completely, but it's a little bit disconcerting. I guess this is why it's good we're standardizing things. Okay, then another question I have is, I'm thinking of a place, because I'm concerned about the unintended consequences, which, as we noted earlier, is always an issue here. And I'm thinking of what might be considered cheaper retail, and generally second stories are. I think the rent is lower on the second story. And around the county, and a place that comes to mind for me personally, it's not currently retail, but it could, for example, would be some of our older stock, like where along Wilson Boulevard, where, for example, Spider Kelly's is, and above that. So the point is that there's one stairwell, one door that goes up some stairs, and then that reaches off, and there's several tenant spaces. They're not retailers right now, but I could kind of picture that somebody might want to open something up there at some point and would then want to have a sign. But this would not, the signage would have to come from the overall building frontage, because this would not qualify for additional second story because they don't have one door per tenant. It's one door that goes in and then opens up to several tenants.
That's correct.
That's correct. And you're perfectly comfortable with that. That's the intent.
Yeah. I mean, another example is Buckingham. Buckingham's a good example because Buckingham is also a historic district, so its signs are also regulated through the HALRB. And when we redid and that's a C2 district, so it doesn't qualify for any of this, but just as an example of where there's second-story retail, that the second-story retailers don't have as much sign area as do the ground-story retails because they don't have that exterior door. They weren't allocated additional sign area. They're also under HALRB review. But as you indicated, they are less expensive. They are less expensive spaces, and they're less expensive for a number of reasons. It's a more challenging place for a retailer to be.
Right, and the question.
But they do have signs.
The question before us tonight is, are we helping them? All right, so my final question before I'll turn to my colleagues is, we've used several times this evening, and you actually have it in the staff report, very explicitly on page 6, there's 3 bullets at the top, and at the end of the third bullet, it's quite clearly stated as a goal without providing an excess amount of sign area. Can you define excess amount of sign area? How do we know when there's too much? Is it kind of like obscenity, you know it when you see it? Or is there, can you characterize what that would mean?
It's something in between those two things. An example I like to use is if you're familiar with the, in Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C., there's a Target and a bunch of other businesses, a Marshalls or a bunch of businesses in one building. That building has signs all the way up and down the building. One of the reasons we regulate signs is for aesthetics. What I think is an excess amount may not be what you think is an excess amount, so no, there is no definition. But we are trying to provide an appropriate amount of sign area, and I think that what staff would propose, and what we've heard from applicants, is that the amount of sign area that's currently provided under the ordinance is adequate for our typical mixed-use building where we have retail on one story, we don't have a public plaza, it's just facing a public street. This is a formula that's worked for a number of years. And we have enough experience with the revised sign regulations at this point to see how it's been applied. I don't think we have an excess amount of sign area. We're trying to sort of maintain that. Once you go overboard, you can't go back. It's very, very difficult to kind of unravel. You can unravel, but the buildings that already have their signs are already going to have their signs.
But there are no examples in Arlington under the old rules that staff would feel, in hindsight, are excessive.
I guess I'm not comfortable opining that. I don't, again, I might have a different opinion than other staff, but I think that we have provided an adequate amount of sign area. We think this formula works. It's the formula that we've been using for years. I will say that under the old rules, it was interpreted very loosely. Some signs were just sort of not counted. So it's like you get X amount of sign area, but then you get all these other signs that don't count. So it is a little hard to sort of gauge how much sign area certain properties got in the past. But it has worked reasonably well moving forward. And again, anecdotally, for your sort of standard building with one story of retail, we've heard that it does work fairly well. It's also, though, it's similar to the formula that's used in many other jurisdictions throughout the country. There are places that say give you 1.5 or 2 or more in a central business district, but 1 square foot of sign area for a foot of linear building frontage is not atypical.
Thank you. I appreciate your answers. Okay, Commissioner Weir.
Just one more question. I remember hearing you say a moment ago that Penrose Square has more signage that it can allocate than it currently has?
Correct.
So what if they have, and using the word in a little bit different context, an excess amount of available signage, what is keeping them from using it?
I think they feel that they don't need it. I mean, I can't answer for them, but not every property uses all the sign area. Even under the old rules, not every property asks for all the sign area that it's allocated under the formula. And under the old rules, sometimes they were asking for more. That's no longer an option. But many properties did not use all of their sign area. It really depends on how the property is configured, how many street frontages it has. Penrose Square has a lot of street frontage, and it has all its retail on just one frontage, but it's got 3 other frontages that give it sign area that gets allocated to the property.
Commissioner Weir, I believe it. I can speak from experience and tell you that I think that there are a lot of property owners who hold some of that back in reserve because if they want to attract a new tenant at some point, they want to that's a bargaining chip. That's something they want to make sure that they're able to accommodate a potential new tenant's desired sign area, and it gets a lot easier not to have to take it from somebody else or to try to reconfigure all that. Commissioner Giacomini and then Commissioner Hughes.
I just have I've been trying to reconcile in my mind how Ballston Quarter is going to work with this amendment. And the only reason I say that is that I'm trying to remember the renderings. We have Pentagon City, and all of those retailers have their signs, but it's all interior to the building. There are some exterior signs. So we don't have to worry about whether any of those businesses have an exterior entrance, right?
Well, there's some now that will front on the plaza.
Yes, but not all of the businesses, not all of the retailers inside. Because you could see when you have a mall situation and you have several retailers, you could use up aggregate sign area pretty quickly, right? Unless you got some bonuses, but you don't need to worry about that in the enclosed mall model. With Ballston Quarter, they're turning the mall inside out and having more exterior accessed retail, and retail that isn't going to be facing inward in a closed building. It's going to be outward. So if it's outward, I don't think on the second story, and I seem to remember there was a second story that was open, each retailer is not going to have a staircase that goes up to it. So I'm thinking that when they come for sign area, they're going to have to use for those second stories part of their aggregate.
So Ballston Quarter could access these sign provisions if it wanted, but more likely it's going to access the regional shopping center sign provisions that were written
Which is the saving
specifically
grace.
for regional
Okay.
shopping centers.
And they're mutually exclusive. An applicant has to choose one or the other.
Yeah, that's correct. And there's only 2 regional shopping centers in the county. There's Pentagon City Fashion Center and there's Ballston Quarter. So those are the 2 properties that would qualify for the regional shopping center sign provisions. Everyone else is going to access these.
Thank you. Commissioner Hughes?
Well, just to keep thinking about it, you're right. I'd sort of forgotten about that we would do special rules for regional. But then the question comes, if we have older buildings that decide to rehab and open up again a second story, and somehow I'm trying to think of where it might happen, that it's a smaller building. Well, I suspect that Roslyn City Center might be one of those, that it's a mall, it was a mall, it's enclosed, they're proposing to change parts of it. What if it opened up more and each of those retailers had to have access to the ground? I guess in my head, I'm not as comfortable with making a second story tenant have to have its own feet on the ground.
Okay.
I'm not opposed to it at this point, but I'm much more have unease about that as I do about the public access easement.
Perhaps you'd like to contemplate a motion for later. Commissioner Hughes?
I want to second Commissioner Giacominni's point just now, but I also then, what it does though is make me think twice about the public easement connection and whether that makes it more appeasing or appealing to use this alternative versus the regional shopping center in a case like that. So, thank you.
All right. Why don't we go ahead and, can you address, please, Ms. Albert, the issue of stories above the second story, third and fourth story retail, and staff's thinking on excluding those from eligibility from these provisions?
I mean, again, it really just ties into providing an adequate amount of sign area for a property. If there's 4 stories of retail, we really don't want to see signs all up and down the building. And if you were to provide sign area for 4 times the street frontage, you still have the same amount of street frontage, whether it's 1 story or 8 stories of retail. So staff proposes that providing that additional, basically already doubling the amount of sign area available for that frontage is appropriate, and more than that would be in excess.
So does the board have at its disposal, or our community, I should say, let's say, for example, I happen to personally think I went to the Art-O-Matic, pop-up art display in Crystal City, that essentially turned, an office building into what could almost be viewed as individual retail for shops for art. So let's say that was very, very successful. It was successful. Somebody wanted to do that, wanted to turn a vacant office building into almost like an indoor mall kind of thing, but wanted to do something really creative in signage to make that work. And setting aside for the moment what is our definition as a community of excess signage, if the board felt that this was just not enough provision and wanted to approve in a specific instance, a really bold kind of signage plan that was much more signage than what even these provisions would allow, is there a mechanism? Can you still do the old way where under a site plan amendment you could still approve more signs? Comprehensive sign plan?
No, there are some very limited opportunities where the county board or where an applicant can go to the board to ask for something. But they're very, very limited, and it doesn't allow you to ask for more sign area than the ordinance allocates you.
So this is really it?
Correct.
Okay.
But that doesn't preclude you from using your sign area to do something really cool and creative.
As long as it's not excessive. All right. Any other questions, or I think we're good. I think we're ready for a motion. Commissioner Guerin, if you please.
I move that the Planning Commission recommend the county board adopt the attached ordinance to amend, reenact, and recodify the Arlington County zoning ordinance to allow additional sign area for properties in commercial mixed-use C districts that contain retail uses and certain configurations to increase the maximum allowed size of blade signs, 13.7, and C&M districts, and to make other related clarifying edits, sections 13 and 18.
Is there a second? Thank you, Commissioner Schroll, second. Okay, so the motion is before us. Are there any discussions, amendments? Commissioner Guerin.
In discussion, I want to say that I do feel strongly about the public access easement. I believe that we should require a public access easement, even given the thoughtful consideration we've heard from Mr. Pritchard and others. We are currently updating the public spaces master plan. This is related. We hear all the time that we do not have enough public space in the county, and we certainly don't have enough that is dedicated in perpetuity. What we're looking for is public space that people know they can count on, that they have access to. It is true that many of the public spaces in Crystal City are beautiful, and if we had to ask you to do something different, I can't think what it would be. Water Park is exceptional. It's like William White's old checklist. Everything is there. It is. It's perfect. So we wouldn't ask a change. It's just that if the ownership changes or somehow that use gets programmed over time and the public doesn't have that constant access to it that they seem to have now, that would be a loss for the community. And that is specifically called out in the Crystal City Sector Plan. As always, when we look at these changes to plans and policies in the zoning ordinance, one of the things we need to do is look at what's best for the community and how these changes, proposed changes, conform to existing plans and policies.
Thank you, Commissioner Guerin. Commissioner Lantelmi.
I'd like to do an amendment to at least poll us for the alternative language that was advertised. I guess I'd like to make a motion, or an amendment, I guess, that we use, could you call up the language, the alternative language on the screen here? Let's see. We recommend the language as advertised by the county, as advertised, which includes the bullet point is open to the public, is not separated from the building facade by an off-street parking area, has at least a portion at grade with the abutting street or sidewalk, is contiguous with the public right-of-way.
So you're moving all four of those bullets that we would adopt that language. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Commissioner Hughes, second. Commissioner Siegel, you have a question?
Clarification, yes. But you're specifically omitting has a public access easement, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
And instead of that, the four purple lettered.
Plus, I guess the first.
Plus the first, right.
All right, anyone want to speak to this motion? Commissioner Hughes.
I'd like to speak to this. You know, when I think about this, first I go to the basic comment that I think Commissioner Lantelmi said earlier, which is if we believe it's not excessive if it's in facing a public easement. Why is it excessive if it's right facing a private public area? I think given the challenges with retail in our community, given the challenges that we have, especially in our interior retail tenants, and if you think about the depth of some of the lots on Crystal City's Crystal Drive, those are some big plazas, and in the very back of them are some very small businesses that serve wonderful lunches. And I think as we drive down it, we always see the Noodles and Company, the Chipotle, all the major tenants that have the big bucks that roll the long national leases, but the smaller ones that are further back in there rarely see the light of day. And so I think about those when I say this, and I say if it's 20% extra is not excessive on a public easement right away, I don't see why it should be excessive in the public-private zone. That being said, I agree. I hope that all of our private spaces that we plan for become public easements. I think they will. I don't think any of our development community has any expectation that they won't. It's just I don't necessarily believe that the zoning ordinance through the sign regulations is the mechanism that we should be trying to achieve those public easements.
I concur with Commissioner Hughes.
Commissioner Schroll.
I have a question for Ms. Albert and then I think a comment. Ms. Albert, you mentioned obviously that this is going to be dealt with administratively. Is the bullet is open to the public? Do you infer that that's 24/7? You alluded to the addition of that language in one of your responses. As you read it now, is open to the public mean 24/7, 365?
I would say that when staff drafted it, then yes, the expectation is that it's open to the public, but the current or future zoning administrator could interpret that in a different way. But that was the intent, that it's generally open to the public, like it would be if it had an easement.
Okay.
But it doesn't say that.
Sure. So I appreciate that. So my reaction to the motion is kind of a reiteration of what Commissioner Giacomini said, and probably not as well articulated. But I think this is having the public access easement is consistent with county policy. We want our public spaces to be to have public access easements on it, and this is well-adopted policy. As Commissioner Giacomini said, this is additional sign area. This is a benefit. This is something we want to incentivize. We want people to come and developers to come and do this. We want them to have an incentive to do that. I understand that it's a hindrance potentially for existing parcels in Crystal City that don't want to redevelop now but want to have additional sign area. But we shouldn't let something that was built in 1960 continue to hinder us. This is supposed to be somewhat forward-looking. We want to encourage some changes to happen, and we want to encourage this behavior to exist. So I understand that it's not without its costs. I certainly am aware of that. But I will not be supporting Commissioner Lentami's amendment.
Commissioner Siegel.
Yeah, I want to sign on also to what Commissioner Schroll has just, I think, laid out in, for me, a convincing way. The issue of the sector plan and what it's calling for, it's an adopted plan. I think it's really important for us to really look hard when we want to derogate in some way from those plans. As a general matter, I'm always very concerned about that. Plans take years to put together, hours and hours of citizen time, and they really need to be upheld. They need to be really considered and re-advertised by the commission. That's sort of one of my standing sort of rules. The other thing is, while I've thought a lot about this, the issue of burden on the developer, I do come back to public access easement. It's something in perpetuity. The public realm needs that kind of support, recognizing there is a sacrifice that we're asking from the private sector, but I think there's a return in the long term to the private sector from a strong and well-managed public realm. Finally, I would say I keep thinking of Pentagon Row, and the signage there is, to me, quite, you know what you're getting when you go there. I don't think, and this may be just one case, additional signage is going to help that retail. I think part of the problem is that Pentagon Row is just cut off from the metro stop. People who come to the shopping center, they don't know that those retail things are there because the wayfinding is bad, the development is just sorts of, you have to go through the parking lot. So for all those reasons, I think I'm not going to support the amendment.
All right, anyone else want to speak to the motion? I will join Commissioner Siegel and Giacomini, and I think Guerin and Schroll in saying that I think to the extent that we're talking about Crystal City in particular, I mean, this is a very large landowner. I don't think checking in with their investors is a major issue for them. I think that they, if this is something that they want to take advantage of, and I have to compliment actually staff for their diligence in pursuing the very explicitly stated goals of the sector plan, and for the foresight that those that participated in that sector plan and had and as a community that we had to actually state that explicit. And this is why we do this, because planning is a long-term game, and it takes, I think, the follow-through at these various junctures that we have the opportunities to actually make them come to reality. And while I don't question for a minute the intent of the building owner, of the property owners in these cases, I think that you know, there's a reason why we want easements, and it is to make it more difficult so that one day you want to abandon it, that you have to come back and there has to be a process to go through that. So I think that Crystal City has a great future in front of it, and these plazas and all of, you know, all of the various elements of the public realm will certainly be documented in one way or the other. This is one mechanism to get there. And I'm also very persuaded by staff's argument that I think also gets to the, you know, the access to the, not only the public easement, but also the second story access. I'm a little less firm on the second story issue, but I am persuaded by the argument that all of this is about enhancing the relationship to the public realm. And if you don't have a direct relationship and there's not, in fact, a public realm, then that defeats the entire purpose of why we set about to do this. So I'm very persuaded by that. So anyone else would like to see? With that, the motion that is in front of us is an amendment to the main motion. It is that we would recommend to the county board that they adopt the 4 alternative bullets on our screen in purple in lieu of the second black bullet, so there would not be a public access easement requirement. It would be the other 4 listed requirements. That's the motion in front of us. All of those in favor, please raise your hand. All of those opposed? The motion fails 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 2 to 8 rather. Okay, so with that, are there any other amendments? Commissioner Giacomini.
I apologize that I didn't have this ready earlier, so bear with me as I try to read my own handwriting. I move the Planning Commission recommend to the County Board that all language requiring a second-floor tenant have at least one exterior public entrance in order to get additional sign area be stricken from the text proposed, recommended for adoption.
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner Hughes.
If I may speak just briefly to this, my inarticulate language is meant to remove the necessity that a second-floor tenant have a direct access at the ground level in order to realize extra sign space. I fully understand it's extra sign, not, above what is already available. But I just thought that I'd see if this would fly.
Any other thoughts? I'd say, Commissioner Yakini, my concern with that is the Pandora's box potential. While I am very weary of the fact that I don't know that we've necessarily agreed on as a community what excess sign area is, I wonder if this wouldn't have the potential to actually flip the equation and actually be more generous than, for example, for our regional shopping centers, and actually that where they would choose this option rather than the previously mentioned amendments that we did. I think it was last year we did those amendments specifically for the regional shopping centers. So the fact that that has not been fully vetted, I don't know if Ms. Albert, if you could address that potential. You don't have to if you don't.
I don't,
Okay.
I'm not sure how the math would play out.
Okay, so you're unclear how the math would play out. That's my main reservation about whether that's not going a little too far to strike it. But we can, anyone else want to speak to the motion? All right, all those in favor? All those opposed? All right, the motion fails 2-8. Okay. Can't say we didn't try. All right, I think we're ready for the main motion. So all those in favor of the main motion, which is just adoption as recommending adoption as proposed by staff. There are no amendments from the Planning Commission. Those in favor of the main motion, please raise your hand. And that motion carries unanimously. All right, thank you very much, staff. So it is 10 o'clock. It's a few minutes before 10. We are going to take a very brief 3.5-minute break while we change over for the Roslyn Streetscape standards. And so please, let's be quick about it. Let's be back here at 1 minute after 10.
I've been on the Transportation Commission. I'm
That's
sure
where
that
I've seen you.
when you were at Walsh Colucci.
That's right. I think you looked really familiar. So I was thinking, planning commissions. TC.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that I knew that you were at Walsh Colucci.
Yeah.
I know was there
She's
at
still
one
at
point in
Green?
time. Oh no, she
No,
wasn't.
I'm way behind.
She was at. She was there for a while. She's at a contractor. I'm not sure exactly.
Hi.
Good to meet you.
Oh yeah, good to meet you. I really appreciated how you guys gave it a full vetting and a full discussion, and I didn't go to Zoto.
Yes, he
It
did.
sounded like it got battered around
He
pretty
did,
well.
and he wrote a letter.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
this
was
is
nice
attached
because the
to
two
this
of
thing.
you sort of echoed each other's. I think they were valid. We really wanted to do that.
Yeah, the only no, I was just telling Elizabeth, like, this is you gave it a full, serious consideration and thoughtful discussion. The only thing I wish I had said that I didn't say, stream of consciousness up there. You're right, like the water park, odds are nothing's going to change there, like in our lifetimes.
Part of it's the location.
But there's other plaza areas where it seems like it would be kind of crazy to grant public access. We, as part of the process, like come to a place with you guys
All right, welcome back. Madam Clerk, would you like to call the next item, please?
Certainly. Our last item is the adoption of the Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan. We have Brett Wallace, our planning staff, to present this item.
Good evening, Mr. Wallace.
Good evening, thank you. Again, my name is Brett Wallace. I'm with the Plan Division Urban Design and Research Section, and very pleased to be here tonight. And I'm joined by members of the Roslyn Business Improvement District, Doug Plowman and Lucia DeCordre behind me, also members from DES staff and planning staff as well. And tonight we're seeking your recommendation to the County Board for adoption of the Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan. So in terms of the outline for the presentation, I'll be giving a brief introduction and background to why we're here tonight, and then I'll be turning it over to Doug from the Roslyn bid to go over the streetscape elements. And then I will then give a brief overview of the plan document itself, and then we'll close with discussion. So in terms of the background, the Roslyn Sector Plan was adopted in 2015, and at the time of the adoption, the streetscape elements were not finalized, and staff has been working with the Business Improvement District over the past couple of years to finalize those documents and designs and what we feel is a very strong plan that's going to enhance the pedestrian environment and the public realm in Roslyn. And the following slides are some excerpts from the sector plan, particularly pages 184 through 85, and this is the streetscape section, guidance, and I've highlighted some of the text, but just overall, the sector plan really does embrace the overall design aesthetic of the streetscape elements and supports the future installation, and also encourages a collaborative process with the bid and county staff to finalize those elements and develop a process for implementation. And finally, the plan also includes the elements that you see here on the slide today, and I will mention that the design aesthetic of these elements here and in the plan has not changed. In fact, we've actually been working with the bid to refine them and looking at technical drawings and details on how it gets rolled out over time, and we've identified some implementation methods which I'll go over shortly. And then lastly, in the sector plan's implementation matrix on page 202, item number 46 calls for staff to coordinate with the Roslyn Business Improvement District to finalize those elements again and establish a process for implementation and installation. Again, is the reason why we're here before you tonight with the Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug from the bid to briefly go over the elements.
Thanks, Brett. As Brett said, my name is Douglas Plowman. I'm the Urban Planning and Design Manager with the bid. Thank you for your time this evening. So firstly, the goals of the plan. Really what we were looking to do was to enhance and beautify the public realm. The goal was to create custom, aesthetically pleasing elements that have a cohesive design. So we really wanted the downtown core of Roslyn to be visually unified as well as engaging for the pedestrian. To do this, the bid engaged Ignacio Ciacchini, a New York-based industrial designer with extensive experience working with bids, and the New York City DOT. So in terms of the process, the first step was to take an initial streetscape inventory of each element within the bid boundaries to identify and to categorize those. New elements were then designed with help from Ignacio to create a menu of the elements. These designs were reviewed internally with the bid's Urban Design Committee as well as with county staff, and that led to the prototype installation in spring of 2016 at the corner of Oak and Wilson. So I wanted to touch just a little bit more on the inventory here. So this is in the appendix of the plan document. So existing elements were evaluated for their visual integrity and how their presence affected the unified and creative streetscape that we hope to create. So there's a full street-by-street inventory in the back of the plan document, if you want to take a look.
So the pilot, this was launched in March 2016, and you can see here in the pictures, County Board Member Weistad was at the unveiling. So the elements of the pilot included benches, planters, newsbox corrals, litter bins, bike racks, and an informational tableau. After the pilot was launched in March, 2 months later, the bid sought feedback from the public, and over 90% of the responses were positive. You can see a detailed breakdown of the questions and the responses in the appendix. And this was in addition to going through various committees and commissions, as well as discussion with the HALRB and Cultural Affairs, Walk Arlington. Many different groups were consulted. So I'm now going to walk through some of the elements, but before I do that, I'd like to just discuss the vendor for this and who's producing these. So these are produced by Landscape Forms. They're a current Arlington County vendor. They've been in business for over 47 years. They're the sole vendor for these elements, which is a practice that the county has used in the past with both DES and Parks and Rec. So the custom products receive the same warranty as their standard products, and Landscape Form really does lead the market with regards to durability. The choice here is to powder coat stainless steel, which is designed to both dissipate heat and shed snow, which only really enhances the longevity of these products. So the benches here, these are modeled on the city bench from New York City. And the design, which I think is really important here, which is consistent throughout all elements. The perforations here are sort of inspired by the rosin, the office, the lights in the buildings. I really think this is something that's unique to rosin and a great identifier for that. So the benches were designed with ergonomic considerations with regards to the seating position, as well as being able to rise up from that, which is where the dividers come in, but also this is a clear delineation of space for people when they're sat in the bench. They can still turn and have a conversation, but it means that 3 people can comfortably sit on the bench at any one time. So I'm going to run through these a little quicker now. This is the City Lock, the bike rack, which meets all of the county requirements, and you can see in the middle there the rosin branding. The next one is the City Charge, which is a solar charging movable device which you can charge up to 6 different devices at any one time. So this can be moved around the bid based on events that are taking place and pedestrian traffic. Info cards is next. This is also movable. You might have seen this at just outside the metro station. So there's lots of different information pieces you can have here. This can promote not only rosin bid events, but also have county information there as well. Next is the newspaper corral, the city corral. So this can hold up to 5 different vendors, and this participation is completely optional, protecting First Amendment rights, and is going to be on a vendor-by-vendor basis, but really has the opportunity to clean up what can sometimes be a tricky, sidewalk element. Additionally, newspaper vending here for paid publications, very similar concept as before. Next is the trash can or the receptacles. So you have recycling as well as trash. These are 40-gallon and they're color-coded depending upon their contents and can easily be served by a bid ambassador. So the tree pits here as well, not only the fence but also the rosin branding. This further enhances the sense of place and identity within Roslyn. Next is the city plan, so once again with the perforations. This is something that can be placed in an area with less green space and sort of tactically placed across the bid to enhance the sidewalk experience. Next is the city marker, also referred to as the tableau previously. So this not only has some sort of small wayfinding components, but also historical elements, which would, of course, go through the HALRB and the necessary groups. But this also can have some public art components and direct pedestrians to nearby areas. So design elements here, it's certainly the content is low enough that it is accessible by all, with the top part being sort of more of a beacon, more of a wayfinder, with the content being at an appropriate level. Next, the cohesive color. This is something, in addition to the elements, just to sort of unify all elements. You can see on the right there the change that was made from the terracotta planters, painting them sort of in a unified color, just tying everything in the bid together. The final element here is the parklet. So in addition to the elements we're looking to do, this would be the first parklet within Arlington County. It's envisioned to increase pedestrian space and to offer another gathering place. The parklet is part of a plan, is part of the plan for adoption. And with that, I'll pass it back to Brett. Thanks. Thank you, Doug. So looking back again at the timeline of events that Doug highlighted, just to reiterate that, the bid really began looking at the streetscape back in 2013 during the Realize Roslyn planning process. The plan was adopted in 2015. We talked about the prototype elements that were installed in March of 2016. And really since March of 2016, staff has been working very closely with the bid to finalize those designs and develop this process, which is resulting in this draft plan before you today. And again, we're seeking adoption of the plan at the county board meeting in 2 weeks. So what's in the plan? The plan is a collection of coordinated street furnishings along with the parklet prototype for the installation of public sidewalks and the public right-of-way within the Roslyn bid. It will be used as a companion document to both the Roslyn Sector Plan and the Roslyn-Ballston Corridor Streetscape Standards. And so staff will refer to both of these documents during site plan review process, both pre and post county board approval. The plan sets forth goals, elements, recommendations, phasing, and design guidelines in the appendix. And again, the elements comprise mostly of street furniture pictured here. I do want to stress that the plan does not include any dimensional changes or changes to sidewalk paving, curbs, utilities, or other street furniture. It is literally a set of street furnishings, including the parklet. In terms of the phasing, which is on page 27 of the plan document, the phasing is really meant to be in line with the Roslyn Sector Plan, focusing on pedestrian priority streets, retail activity, and where development is occurring. So there is flexibility built into the phasing to allow for the ongoing development in Roslyn. And the bid will be providing updates to the county board annually when the work plan and budget is approved. So if there's a construction project and phasing has to be shifted to another area, the bid would provide that update at that time. And phase 1 does include the prototype, which is highlighted in red on the corner of North Oak and Wilson Boulevard here. So in terms of implementation, this is also on page 28 of the plan document. Staff really feels that there are 3 methods that are going to be most common going forward. The first being a funding request from the bid through their work plan and budget hearing with the county board approval. And one example of this might be replacing trash receptacles or recycling bins, or adding some of the planters at a corner to add greenery where that's lacking. The most common method of implementation we see is with new site plan development going forward. Again, I mentioned earlier, this will be a companion document to the sector plan. We will use this plan as a tool during the public process and review of site plan projects, but also after the county board approves a plan, we'll be looking at it through the final landscape and engineering plan review, looking at the appendix and some of the more detailed to make sure that it's fully implemented. In terms of the last method, which is also a pretty common method, is administrative changes to landscape plans, and this is really the older site plans in Roslyn. As development in Roslyn began back in the 1960s, there are a lot of older site plans that may wish to upgrade their street furniture and add new elements by submitting an application to the zoning office. That can be reviewed and approved administratively by staff and the zoning administrator. One example of that recently was JBG recently installed the furniture at Central Place, as their plan was approved in 2007 with different style of benches and trash receptacles and bike racks. And after the sector plan adoption, they wanted to bring, upgrade their furnishings to be compliant. And again, we will be looking at this plan throughout the whole review of any administrative change application for compliance. The application for administrative changes would, as always, would include a letter of support and consent from the property owner. And additional guidance is listed in the matrix in the plan on pages 28 and 29. So in terms of the parklet prototype, fully detailed drawings are in the appendix of the plan. But I do want to point out, this is really a site-specific parklet prototype on the corner of North Oak and Wilson Boulevard, and that future parklets in Roslyn or elsewhere in the county will require a separate process and county board action. In terms of the design review, staff has completed the review. The county attorney's office is working on a draft memorandum of agreement for county board approval. We're hoping that that is ready in June. If not, it may be the following month. In terms of fabrication, 3 to 4 months is what the manufacturer is noted. And with that, we're looking at a tentative installation date of the fall of this year. And in terms of evaluation, staff and the bid will continue to monitor the prototype for a period of 1 year by conducting sidewalk and online surveys and just basic observation throughout the seasons, looking at traffic operations and maintenance, and then conducting routine inspections. And I do want to point out, and this was a common theme as we went to other commissions, is this truly a public space? And the answer is yes, and it will be signed as such. And here's a detail of the signage that will be mounted on the edge of the planter here. And these are just some existing pictures from where the parklet prototype will be located on North Oak Street. The picture in the upper left corner shows the 2 parking spaces that will be converted to the parklet prototype. And then in terms of a plan view, this is the parklet location. It is located, a certain distance back from the intersection for sightline visibility and safety, but also access, ADA access. And I do want to point out on the right side of it is a future capital bike share station that is planned to also serve as not only a compatible use with the parklet, but also serve as a visual and physical barrier as well. But I do want to point out that that bike share station is not part of this plan. Bike share has their own separate process for installation. And then in conclusion, in the appendix of the plan, I do want to point out some very detailed design guidelines that we prepare for each of the elements. And so this is just one example of the bench. You can see some of the technical drawings on the dimensions. We've got materials and finishes, the different color options. There's different siting considerations on where to locate these benches so that in the future applicants can refer to these guidelines when preparing landscape plans for site plan approval. And this is just another example of the bike rack. But again, as Doug mentioned earlier, a lot of this applicants will have to follow our DES bike parking specifications in addition to some of the other details listed here. And so in terms of our process, other than the bid starting back in 2013 during the sector plan planning process, we've since, like I said, finalized those elements. We've been to the Transportation Commission, both for info item and last week for an action item. We've been to the Pedestrian Advisory Committee for info. We presented at Long Range Planning Committee. The request to advertise at the county board a couple weeks ago, and then looking ahead at the 17th or the 20th for the county board with the requested action for adoption of the plan. And at all these commissions, I will point out, the plan was generally well received, and we're looking forward to the adoption. And so with that, I'll conclude the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks to both of you. I know that obviously Transportation Commission heard this. You want to go ahead, Commissioner Schroll, and give that report.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as Mr. Wallace noted, we heard this as both an info and as a action item last week. Our discussion was centered mainly on the parklet to some extent, and the use and design, which Mr. Wallace covered. Some concern expressed by at least one of the commissioners about the unfriendliness of the bench design for homeless people. Question about the MOU that would follow on for the MOU for this process that would be adopted by the board at the same time, what process that would go through. And then some questions about kind of the placement of the street furniture and whether that would differ at all from existing practice. The Transportation Commission voted 10-0 to 1 to recommend that the county board adopt the proposed streetscape standards.
So beyond the items that you noted for discussion, there was no specific recommendations, though?
There was no motion. There was that was just generally our discussion.
Sure. Thank you for that. All right. Let's do public speakers.
Jim Jerez.
Mr. Jerez.
No neighborhood in Arlington County has embraced new urbanism, or another view, new urbanism has embraced no other neighborhood like Roslyn. Ballston is a close runner-up. When you voted to approve the redevelopment of the block, including Wilson School in Roslyn, you heard much unhappiness from Roslyn and Radnor Fort Myer Heights residents about the redevelopment. Almost 500 residents of the 11th at Vermont neighborhood in Ballston recently signed a petition opposing a GLUP upzoning of their neighborhood. In Roslyn, the Planning Commission and County Board repeatedly vote for not only a repurposing, but a re-repurposing of urban infrastructure. That is, streets and any parcel of public open space become recreation and activity space for any number of events, festivals, races, open-air markets, anything, everything. That, in addition to as many pedestrians, bicycles, and motor vehicles packed into small areas via mixed-use, high-density site plans, which you also recently approved, like Wilson School. In fact, there is no comprehensive traffic impact analysis across the entire Roslyn sector. So where will Roslyn residents go for sports and recreation activities that require large amounts of open space, or any amount of open space beyond plazas and tot lots? To suburban neighborhoods where neighborhood parks have been expensively repurposed into multi-purpose sports, recreation, activity facilities. Also used, depending on the neighborhood, like my neighborhood, by thousands of non-residents. Finally, in the most recent version of smart growth, residential neighborhoods far from Roslyn will be repurposed into so-called missing middle workforce housing for persons who work in vibrant mixed-use Roslyn buildings and earn less than $40,000 a year. A huge financial windfall for residential renovation developers and contractors, Mr. Gutschall. You know anybody that might fit that category, Mr. Gutschall? Mr. Gutschall's nodding yes. Thank you.
I'm acknowledging the question. Thank you, Mr. Jerez. Any other speakers? Okay. All right, the matter is before the commission. Commissioner Giacomini, would you like to give us an LRPC report?
Certainly. The LRPC met on Monday, May 15th to discuss the proposed new Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan. That evening, both Mr. Plowman and Mr. Wallace gave us a great presentation, as they did this evening. And we discussed the various new furniture. We talked about the pilot that had been done on Wilson Boulevard, and we talked a lot about the newest element, which would be the parklet. Some of the questions I have at the bottom of the memorandum that I distributed with as the LRPC report, I think a lot of these have actually been addressed in the staff report this evening. One was, how will the streetscape elements plan be used by staff in the evaluation of site plans, and what force does it have? I think we heard this evening they will be using this just as they use the Roslyn-Ballston streetscape plan, to which we very much have developers adhere. Will the bid be solely responsible for deciding where new elements are added outside the site plan process, or will county staff also decide? I mean, that's one question we may still want to talk about, even though there is the phasing plan. It's along the blue lines or the red lines or the green lines at what point outside of a specific site plan coming before us? How is it that the area will be filled in? There was a question raised at LRPC about the cost of the new elements. Also, would the manufacturer always have them available? I think we heard that this is a contractor, the manufacturer of one of long-standing. Plus, with the very detailed design drawings and the appendix, one could probably, if one manufacturer ceased to exist, be able to take these very detailed drawings and specs out to another vendor and have the same furniture produced. What will the process be for changing or adding elements to the streetscape plan? How will data be collected to evaluate various aspects and efficacy of the trial parklet? And I think there were some strategies that staff went over this evening. And how will the public know they have access to the parklet? How will it be signed? So we saw an example of a rather small sign, but probably aesthetically pleasing. So that's what we had from LRPC, and I don't know if other people have any other questions, or if they feel that these questions that were raised have been answered already.
Thank you, Commissioner Iacomini. All right, so let's just open it up. What I'd like to do, so it's 10:30, is I'd like to spend probably about 10 or 15 minutes on questions, if we need that much time. But I would like to get to a motion by 10:45. So, questions. Let's go first. I'll get you in a second, Commissioner Schull. Let's go to Commissioner Weir first, please.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to address the issue, and you'll tell me, Mr. Chair, if I should hold off until later, of the hostile versus friendly architecture. I was the commissioner that brought that up. I also abstained because I thought that the plan was too good to vote against, but at the time I was too concerned about the particular issues raised by the bench architecture to support the plan affirmatively. After having had a few subsequent conversations, what I would report to the commission, and with that point having been put before the commission, is that the understanding of the people who work with the affected communities, with the homeless community in the Roslyn area, is that the benches are really not where that community looks for shelter, especially given the covered metro stop and other places in the church where people actually do take shelter. And I think that there was some conversation about potentially using some of the other streetscape elements, like the information carts, to put information to Arlingtonians about about how we care for our homeless populations in Roslyn and the county more generally, but we're talking about Roslyn here. I am still concerned with the image of what could be understood as, and I think out of context in this case, what could be understood as hostile architecture. But as I said to a friend of mine, if City Lab were to run an article on the trend of hostile architecture and use a picture of one of our benches, my exact words were, City Lab gonna City Lab. I mean, we can't really stop them from doing that. I am no longer of the mind to object or even abstain to the particular element, and I intend to support the plan wholeheartedly given the conversations that I've had. So just with the context of that one note about the vote and the concern of the Transportation Commission, I wanted to tell the fellow commissioners where I was, in hopes that that might answer any questions and potentially close that loop if it can.
Well, thank you for sharing your journey of discovery. That's actually quite helpful. Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Commissioner Gosho. It's not the only hostile benches we do have in the county. There are plenty of others, but so it won't just be the one that makes City Lab. My question with regard to Commissioner Iacomini on the cost/design replication vendor, I agree. It sounds like we've got a great vendor. The vendor's been a great partner with the county for years. But the bottom line is vendors always do and can change. So do we own, the county or the bid, the design rights to the elements that we're currently recommending?
So the designer, Ignacio, owns the rights to the design, to the physical designs. The vendor is the sole producer, but Ignacio has the rights to the designs.
All right, Commissioner Schroll and then Commissioner Ricks.
Mr. Wallace, on page 27 of the draft report, the phasing map, I still think we're missing the future street connection for 18th Street. I think it's supposed to go all the way through.
Okay, noted. Through Central Place?
Yeah.
The plaza?
So
There you go.
we're in a site plan now. It's going to
Yep.
do that.
Commissioner Ricks.
Yes, Mr. Wallace, I think you mentioned paving is specifically.
Commissioner Ricks, is your mic on?
It is.
You might have to speak a little more directly into it. Thank you.
Premium paving is eliminated or not part of this plan. It's in some other plan, streetscape plan? That's a question. And if it is, are we reconsidering anything besides the current interlocking brick pavers?
So our standard is a poured-in-place concrete in the clear sidewalk. We do encourage the use of decorative pavers, bricks, things of that nature in the furnishing zone between the clear sidewalk and the curb. A lot of that is outlined in the RB corridor streetscape standards and other standards in our Department of Environmental Services.
Encouraged, but not required.
Well, we do allow decorative pavers in those zones, but our standard for the clear sidewalk is a poured-in-place concrete. Does that answer?
I'm actually going to interject here. So Commissioner Ricks, I understand your question, but I think that is actually not part of these streetscape element plans. That's in a different document, a different but. So I think it's something that we could, if you wanted more information on that, you can certainly follow up with staff, but I'm going to move us along because it's not specifically in this plan that's in front of us this evening.
Okay.
So forgive me for moving that along. Commissioner Siegel.
Yeah, I want a little bit of clarification of a couple of questions, then a couple of comments. Bear with me, I'll be brief. On page 3 of the larger document that we got, or you presented in the first slide, the sector plan embraces the overall design aesthetic of the streetscape elements envisioned in the BIDS master plan. Where is that document? The BIDS master plan? I know we have the streetscape, Rosalind Ballston streetscape plan, but a separate document is the BIDS master plan?
So I apologize for the confusion. We actually addressed that in the staff report, but initially during the Rosalind sector planning process, the BID on their own initiative prepared a streetscape master plan, and that's what this text was referring to, so that may be a typo that we'll need to remove or correct. But following the sector plan adoption, we then reevaluated it, and because most of the elements are installed in the public right-of-way, therefore the county, we needed to own the plan, and we changed the language from streetscape master plan to streetscape elements plan. But it is outlined in the staff report, but I can look at the document.
The reason I bring it up is that I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the aesthetic. I don't know if this is an art historian's way of looking at this, but I see it as functional, industrial, modern, the aesthetic that runs through the elements, the different pieces of furniture. My personal reaction to it is just worry that while I absolutely appreciate the ability of that aesthetic to unify one's sense of being in a place called Roslyn, and that's a good thing, and it won't be higgledy-piggledy and scattered. On the other side of things, I just worry that there's an opportunity for street furniture to kind of enliven an area. And I had a question about how does this do that? It's very functional. There's some interesting pieces like solar charging stations, which are really very welcome. And but at the same time, I just worry that does this become boring? And so I was happy to see the colors that are recommended. And also, going back to a question that was raised, will there be a process for changing or adding or even varying elements to the streetscape plan in case we do find that once we've created the unification that we want with the elements, that maybe we could find a way to make them more welcoming and fun? That's the question.
Yeah, so I think the aesthetic is definitely it's certainly of the industrial style. It is certainly a very distinct style, but I would argue that it's fairly in keeping with the new buildings that are coming in with Central Place, with 1812, fairly similar with those. And I think the point that you raised, you know, a lot of the elements are sort of the powder-coated stainless steel, but there's also the plaza chairs, for example, which are in the brand colors of the bid, of the purple, the yellow. So that would certainly enliven public spaces, and I think, you know, the parklet is certainly an opportunity in the future potentially to have some more creativity to come in. I think functionality of these elements is their primary focus, and I think as these changes maybe down the line happen, we can maybe get a little more creative, but I think primarily the function and the just making sure they work, that they work and they can last in the public realm was certainly the priority.
But there is some scope for varying, an increased variation down the line, that we're not strangled by the aesthetic here.
Yeah, so in the staff report, we in the discussion section have a paragraph speaking to future plan updates. One example, the circular planters that were shown earlier, you know, should the bid wish to develop a rectangular or hexagonal planter, as long as it's in the same design aesthetic with the perforations that was embraced in the sector plan, we're recommending in the staff report that we could review that administratively and not have to go back to the county board, for example, for a minor amendment like that. So we understand that things are going to evolve and change, and so as long as it's in keeping with that aesthetic, we're recommending to approve those administratively in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Lantelmi.
Following up on Commissioner Siegel's comments, will you then also, along these lines, be keeping the Adirondack chairs that you've put out in various spots? Because I've seen those, and I think those also say Roslyn. They're sort of the social aspect of Roslyn. They can be moved around a bit, and they're colorful, they're nice. I think they fit with these. You will be keeping those then?
I believe so. I think it's something that we would certainly look to bring in some more of the plaza chairs, but I think that there could certainly be a balance struck, and I think we have a strong inventory of those currently, so we would certainly look to keep those, and as long as they're working and functional, I think they would certainly still be in the realm.
Okay.
All right. I have a question. In the elements, I see a bike parking rack, but it's only a single one. If there's a need for multiple, you would just put many of those next to each other, or is there an option for how to handle multiple greater capacity.
Right, our current bike parking specifications have layout plans for placement and spacing for multiple bike racks adjacent to one another.
Okay. And then a follow-up to the question of cost and the availability in the future. So what I've heard this evening is it's a well-established manufacturer, so we don't have any reason to believe there would be an availability issue in the future. But it is a proprietary design that is controlled by the designer, so it's not within our power to go out and find an alternative vendor. That would have to be something. Are we licensing this from the designer, or the current vendor licenses it from the designer? Sorry. We don't. Do we have any licensing to the design?
I'd like to apologize. The design is owned by the bid.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Lucci. That's good. Good to know. And then so on the question of cost, and I'm not sure I want to get into very specific dollars because they wouldn't necessarily have real meaning to me. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess how much these benches ought to cost. But I think the main point is if you could just confirm for me that that you guys are satisfied through this process that we've gone from, that these are they're within the realm of reasonableness of cost, and we don't anticipate that there would be pushback from future, and I'm really thinking about future site plans where we're going to ask our property owners to implement these. And even I think I see the language in there that is talking about, even as potential site plan amendments come in, we're going to sort of expect people to catch up to where we are. That you don't anticipate, because you feel like you've done a thorough job of the viability and the economic viability of these, that they're going to be within a reasonable cost factor for any of these property owners.
Yes, so I spoke to the vendor, and certainly with it being a custom item, it's difficult to compare directly, but what they did do was they compared the pricing for the Roslyn custom elements to the range that they offer of the, sort of semi-custom products that they offer as well, and all the products fell within the range that they were offering. So as well as work that Lucia did previously on sort of the bargaining on the initial price, I think it's satisfactory for it to be within that realm.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And lastly, very sort of mundane question, but I do want to know what's the difference between the RBIC and the RBID? So the Roslyn bid, whatever that. Just tell me what that is. The Roslyn bid, what is it? It's the Roslyn Business Improvement Corporation versus the Roslyn Business Improvement Service District. What's the relationship there? I've never heard of RBIC before.
This was, if I could address that, a direction from our county attorney in looking at the service agreement, just trying to keep the language consistent, but that the service district is referring to the geographical boundary of where they can implement services.
Sure.
And RIBIC, being the corporation, is the entity of legalized name for the bid.
So what we've in the past referred to colloquially as the bid it will now be known as RIBIC. For Claire, or is that only in the context of this document?
That would be any legal documents, so contracts, it would be RBIC.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not a new entity created specifically for this exercise. All right, enough on that then, because now I've brought us past 10:45. So Commissioner Giacomini, would you like to make a motion?
Sure. I move that the Planning Commission recommend to the County Board that they adopt the resolution adopt the resolution to adopt the Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan, which is attached to the draft staff report dated May 30th, 2017.
Second.
Commissioner Schroll, second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. It passes unanimously. Thank you. I think a very excellent job done by all parties. It's exciting, Very nice job.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, guys. So that concludes those items on our agenda. So very quickly.
Mr.
we'll move
Chairman,
on.
I'd like to move the minutes in block, if you don't mind.
Oh, there we go.
Commission dated May 10th and May 11th, 2017.
Seconded, Commissioner Giacomini. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any?
No, we're not doing that anymore.
Any? The only reason you would abstain is if you actually weren't on the commission, but, okay, so all those in favor? It's okay, we'll live. All those opposed? Any abstentions? I believe Commissioner Ricks, we're gonna make him abstain. He's abstaining. All right. Is there any staff report? All right. The June 13th work session with the county board, that is solid, confirmed, right? Will there be a notice going out?
I believe the county board notice takes care of both of it, but we'll check to make sure. If needed, we'll send one.
Right, because we haven't gotten an email yet. So for everyone's calendars, so that's a week from tomorrow. It'll be a work session between the Planning Commission and the County Board. We will be discussing primarily the implementation of the revisions to the SPRC procedures, the operating guide, and those things that Jane talked about last month. And we'll also be talking about opportunities, sort of training and professional development and facilitation facilitation training for commissioners. So basically some staff resources to help bring folks up to speed that are new commissioners and to help those that have been here to be more productive. And
What time is that?
So it'll be 7 p.m. right here on Tuesday the 13th. And there will be a notice coming out, I'm sure, via email with the more specific agenda, but that's generally what we will be talking about. All right, the letters for this evening.
Does that mean that there
Sure.
will not be a ZOCO meeting?
On the 13th?
The ZOCO meeting, I believe, on the 13th is still on the calendar.
There will not be a ZOCO meeting.
No, there's a joint ZOCO LRPC on Monday the 12th.
All right. So the letters for this evening, Commissioner Siegel has agreed to do the Williamsburg Neighborhood Conservation Plan update. Commissioner Guerin, you'll do the zoning ordinance amendment for us. Thank you. And Commissioner Schroll has agreed to do the Roslyn Streetscape Elements Plan letter. And then just a quick note, Commissioner Weir acknowledged in his comment earlier that he was at Transportation Commission. So effective now, basically, after this month, Commissioner Schroll will be resigning from the Transportation Commission, and Commissioner Weir will be our liaison to the Transportation Commission from this point forward, basically. That's all I got. I think unless anybody has anything particularly burning that they would like to report. See, look at that. Madam Clerk, we are 9 minutes early. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.